It may actually be streaming.
Oh, here it is. Meeting is now live streaming on Facebook.
Yay, we're live. Okay. Now that I'm completely discombobulated. Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Branch of Laurels. I'm a Shaxi from Ontier, and I have been on almost a year-long journey of interviewing Laurels from around the known world. And tonight, my guest is Sigrid, Brian's daughter, who is most famous for null binding and the research of null binding. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited that you volunteered. I have been forever jealous that of some of your travels and some of the things you've seen. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your story. So I usually start these off by asking your SCA origin story. How did you find the SCA and what made you fall in love with it?
I found the SCA by a gentleman that I was dating just after I graduated high school. That summer after I graduated high school. We met at a Scandinavian folk festival, folk dance festival in particular, because I was Midsummer's Festival, because I was recently back from Sweden by only 1 year. Having been an exchange student. And so I was still very much in Scandinavian culture, and he could dance. Oh my goodness, he could dance. So we met, we started dating. He was originally from Poolsbo, which was not terribly far from Port Angeles, actually. Port Angeles. We met in Poolsbo. He was from Port Angeles. And he wanted to go see his dad, so we went up to go see his dad, and he was like, "Where are all my friends?" And they're like, "Oh, they're off at an SCA event." And he's like, "They are? Where is it?" So I'm just gonna go visit my boyfriend's dad. I have no idea what's going on. And he goes and drags me off to this event in the middle of nowhere, in the trees, and it was beautiful. It was marvelous and magical. And I stood there we were only there for like an hour while he caught up with a couple of people, and I'm standing there in my modern clothing going, okay, this happens. How does this happen? How do I do this? How do I get involved in this? This looks cool. And so he told me about what the SCA was, and we did go back to a few, I went to one other little short one, but not long after that, I joined the military and I shipped off to basic. And so I was kind of busy. So I did basic, and then I went to language school, and I was in Monterey, California for a year. And as interesting as the SCA is, there's an awful lot of things to do in Monterey. Really, there are. So off I went and enjoyed that. And then I did the next school, and then the next school. And finally, I got stationed out in Maryland, and I was finally settling down enough. Now, this is about 2 years later. And by this point, my mother is seneschal of her local group, because I told her about this cool thing that my then boyfriend was interested in. And so she went and found her local group, and now she's seneschal. So I'm like, Mom, I want to find my local group. But of course, I'm in Maryland. Mom's in Western Washington State. So, and this was a while ago. So there was no convenient internet or web to go look up your local group on. So it involved Mom calling the person she knew who lived furthest to the east, who then called the person they knew furthest to the east, and so on and so forth, until it got over to Maryland, got the seneschal and the Chatelain's name, and it went back to get to Mom, so that Mom could call me, so that I could call them. And the first time I got a hold of them, it was just before Penzic, and they said, "We're all going to be at Penzic for a while. There's nothing happening except we're going to be at Penzic. You're welcome to come if you'd like to come." But, I only had a little bit of time off at the time. So we just went for that last weekend of Penzic. Now, Penzic was still happening on Sundays then, and not like it is now. So we went Friday night, my roommate and I, and we found the local group, we found Lockmere, and we popped up our little tiny child's tent, 6 by 3, 3 feet high. Little tiny child's tent, smack dab in the middle of the courtyard, because there really wasn't anywhere to put it. And it's the last weekend. And we put it in the middle of the courtyard, and we put a brown tarp over the top of it, and we just kind of called it the Fairy Knoll. which is how we found it at night. You walked around, half bent over with your fingers out going, okay, where is it? Where's the fairy knoll? It's got to be around here somewhere. We went off, we played, we came back, we slept, we got up in the morning on Saturday. We went out to explore Penzic. Lochmere disappeared on us. We come back and it is our fairy knoll in a field.
Oh, wow.
They all go home on Saturday and we were staying until Sunday. And so we enjoyed it. We stayed until Sunday. We had a great time. We went home and I promptly lost the phone numbers. And so by January, I decide, okay, I'm ready to go. I want to go again. Mom, I need the phone number because, I'm a 20-year-old who's, easily distracted. Here we go with the phone tree again. Then back again. And I call them up on like Thursday night and they're like, oh, 12th night's this weekend. But you don't want to go to that. It's too far away. You want to go to our event that's like 3 weeks from now. And I'm like, you don't get to tell me which event I want to go to or not. If I want to go, give me the addresses for both. I might want to go to both. They're like, nah, it's like in Blacksburg, Virginia. It's like 300 miles and change. Okay, guys, I come from Antier. What's 300 miles? I didn't know I came from Antier at the time, but it's the same difference. I come from Washington State. What is 300 miles? Who cares? So being the non quite fully thinking 20-year-old that I was, I hopped in my car with my roommate and we drove to 12th night. It was great. And about a half hour out from 12th night, we realized it was starting to snow. But, it's okay. It's just a little bit. By the time we get to 12th night, there's like an inch on the road. I grew up in Western Washington State. You can drive in an inch. What difference does it make? Mountain regions, West Virginia. Oh, and one of the most major snowstorms ever. So we had 12th night and 13th night and 14th night because they closed the freeways because we got 2.5 feet overnight.
Wow.
It was great. We had like the entire hotel except for like 2 rooms in the hotel were all Scadians. Well, when we started, we were all Scadians by the time we were done. And we took over the hotel restaurant because of course the hotel workers couldn't go home. We're like, dudes, here, we're clearing out some rooms. You go to sleep. We're taking over. We ran the kitchen, we fed ourselves. They gave checks to the guys with the 4x4s to go to the grocery store to get us food. And we had an absolutely marvelous time. Of course, only the only planned events were for 12th night. So 13th night and 14th night involved people. If you brought projects with you and you had extra stuff, how about you volunteer to teach something because we're otherwise all stuck here. And so that is actually where I physically learned to nullbind. I knew what nullbinding was because of the town that I lived in Sweden. But I didn't physically learn how to nullbind until that 12th night, which isn't technically my first event, but it's my first event from when I started actively playing.
Right.
I had a kind of a sporadic year and a little bit of knowledge ahead of time. But I was constant from there. I went to that event, the next event 3 weeks later, met my now husband. I went to like events every month afterwards and I was, null binding up a storm and all of that. And we'll get more into that when we get to the pictures.
Awesome. Do you want to go ahead and look at pictures now?
Yeah, we could start that.
Okay, let's start that. Because you put together an amazing
show. 13th night leads into the first picture excellently.
And I need to fix the picture setup. So hold on just a second. Sorry. Okay. We tested it beforehand and the windows switched around. So I have it fixed. So I'm going to share the screen now. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so here we are.
There it is. So this first picture here is my original sock. This is the sock that I null bound at 12th night and 14th night.
Wow.
So my teacher, Anna Leleevna, had some spare roving, pencil roving yarn, and taught me how to null bind. And so she started out and she just taught me how to get started and how to make the first couple of pivots. And then she kind of went, okay, I'm done. And, class is over. It's like an hour and change. And so I did that until, I need to get bigger. How do I get bigger? Well, you know what? We're stuck in a hotel. She can't be that far away. Where is she? So I went and I found her. I'm like, so how do I make it bigger? She's like, well, you put 2 in the same hole. Oh, okay. So I did that for a while until I get closer to the heel. And I'm like, I gotta do something for this heel. How do I turn a heel? So, wander around the hotel again until I found her. And I'm like, how do I turn a heel? I need to go back the other way. And so she showed me how to do that. And I did that. And then how do I make it smaller? Because now I've got to shrink the ankle. And she showed me that. And then I ran out of yarn and she didn't have any more yarn.
Oh.
And I was sad. And of course I had to wait until I got home after having shoveled out my 6-day-old brand new baby, first ever brand new car, using a trash bin and wearing clogs. Not exactly the best idea, but it was fun. I had a great time and I'm still here. Next. So this picture is a really, really old picture. I think this is the first picture of me in the SCA that I know of. This would have been about 2 events later. So it was not the Lochmere event afterwards, but it was a Dunkerque event. And that sideless surcoat I absolutely adored and I wore until it wouldn't fit anymore. But the red dress underneath it laced up the back and I very quickly stopped wearing that.
Because clothes you can't get in and out of yourself are not good.
It didn't fit all that great either because, I was still learning how to fit things.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't terribly comfortable, but that sideless surcoat came out perfect and I wore it for ages. And then eventually I gave it to someone else who it fit, who wore it for ages. And the gentleman to my right is the guy that I'm hoping to get sweet on. Yes. Which you'll notice, this is now in like May, I think. I did. And we're still not admitting to the rest of the world that we're dating yet. And they're a little confused. Next. So this is me a year later. I've been playing with the SCA. I'm now chatelaine for the group. And this is my prize for winning croquet that day, which was a problem because I wasn't supposed to beat the queen. I was trying not to beat the queen at croquet and I failed. But it was a good thing because it is the only reason that I actually even stayed for court. Because by then I was in a full fibromyalgia flare up and I hurt really, really bad and I couldn't think. And so I went up and I got my prize for the croquet tournament. I'm like, okay, this is good. A few more minutes and then I can go home. And then the queen calls me into court. This is the day of my AOA.
Oh.
Which I didn't quite even understand or realize until like about a week later, because it took that long for the flare up to wear off. Next. So this is my first display at Pennsic. So I decided I was going to enter the Pennsic A&S competition. And this is the first year that they shifted it from competition to display only. And I was like, okay, well, I'll take my stuff out. I'll put it out there. I'll put it on display and then I'm going to go eat lunch. It's like noon, right? So I put everything out. I set everything up and I get back and I take a picture and I am just about to leave, right? To go eat something because I probably haven't really eaten breakfast yet either. And somebody comes and asks me a question and somebody comes and asks me a question and I talk about it and I talk about it and I answer the questions. And eventually someone was kind enough to bring me some water because I didn't get to leave that display until 5:30 when they were shutting it down.
Wow. People were really interested in what you were doing.
people were really, really interested. I ended up with one of those absolutely cool, you will never forget moments out of this, because as everybody was shutting down and we were, we'd kicked all the people out so that the artisans could close stuff up, and I'm packing things up, this very, very well-dressed Viking lady comes up to me and she says, I could hear you clear across the tent. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to distract from all of everyone else. And she's like, no, you were passionate, you were interesting, you wanted to talk about it, everyone wanted to listen. She goes, it was amazing, it was excellent, and I could hear you from across the tent, but I didn't want to distract you during the time frame when everybody was asking the questions. So but I wanted to give you this as a thank you for, for what you did today. And I went, oh, okay, cool. And it was this little potpourri basket, little urn-shaped potpourri basket with a lid and a little ring on the top. And I was, oh, thank you, that's very nice of you. And she wandered off, and I, had no idea who she was from Adam. And I sniffed at this potpourri basket, but it didn't really have any smell. Well, this kind of confused me. Okay, all right, well, it's cute, that's nice. A couple of days later, I'm like, it still doesn't have any smell. I don't get it. Oh, it rattles. It rattles. Maybe there's something in there. I tried the top. It didn't really want to come. I didn't want to break it, right? I finally open it up, and she's given me a collection of miscellaneous bead chips, some lampwork beads, a pendant, a pin, and this little tiny bag, velvet bag inside with some low-grade lapidary grade emeralds and a ruby in it, and a little note as to who she was, and a thank you from her. Wow. And that was the Viking Antsy lady.
Oh, how cool.
Took me a while to figure it out, but but it was, and I was just like, oh my God, I will never forget that. I still have it. One of these days I got to do something with those.
That's awesome.
Some cool fancy thing to do with them. But
I think it's important to remember that those kind of tokens, giving them to people that are doing good things, are really, really impactful.
Extremely impactful. I mean, I had a lot of other things that happened to me afterwards, and that happened to me probably in the first 2 years of my being in the SCA. I've been in now for 25. It is still one of the most impactful memories I have. Anybody has the power to do that. It doesn't require that you have some rank or fancy. You can do that. It's a little helpful to have a certain amount of rank and fancy, because you can put a little extra pomp and circumstance into that, but it's not required. Anyone can do it. You can give that thanks that might make or break somebody's SCA career. Okay, so this next photo, I am now moved back to Antier. I got out of the Army. I was getting ready to go to college. In fact, I think I was actually in college by a year at this photo. And the mitten that I'm working on there, that I don't know why the old film makes it glow so much, because it's not that fuzzy. That particular mitten is my first figuring out how the Osla mitten actually worked. So I was being so proud, because this is where I made the transition. This is really the transition between, I just nullbind stuff because it's cool and it's fun to do. And that display, I had some books out and stuff, but I really wasn't researching yet. What I was doing was collecting things. The only place we had to display in the mid to late 1990s was at competitions. There wasn't really any open display sort of thing. And if you were going to put something in a competition, you had to have some documentation, although the standards were a little looser at the time. And most of what I was doing was low level, small baronial group, shire group level stuff anyway. So what would happen is I would, someone else would show something, and maybe they showed something about null binding, and I would ask them, can I have a copy of your documentation? And I kept collecting the stuff. I mean, I even went out and got Margaret Hall's ancient textiles from bogs and burials. You could still go to Barnes and Noble at the time and order it from the publisher, and they'd reach out to the publisher and see if it could still be sent. I mean, this is 1995. The book was published in 1980, you know, but they'd reach out to the publisher. Do you have any left? About 3 weeks later, they'd call you up and say, we have heard absolutely nothing from the publisher. Hi, Lily. Are you coming to join us?
Don't tear the background down, Kitty.
Yeah. Yeah, she's very intrigued by this because that's not usually there. But anyway, so they'd call and say, well, we haven't heard anything from the publisher, so we don't expect that they've got any more copies. And okay, that's so sad. 3 weeks later, they go, the book has arrived. Do you still want it? Yes, please.
Yes, please.
At the original $30 published price. Absolutely.
Wow.
I did it twice. I got one for Mom too. And so I had done that. Oh, no, you don't. Excuse me. I have to control the leaper here. Holy cat is crazy. Anyway, so we had yes, I was getting the book and right. So I had 2 years worth of, I just loved making null binding stuff, but I was not ready for research at all. I just come out of high school. I was tired of school. I went straight into the Army and spent a year in language school. I was done with the study thing. I wasn't up to it. And I was in a lot of pain too. Chronic pain, you know, cuts down on the amount of brain energy you have to focus on anything.
For sure.
So I was collecting the stuff, and there wasn't even a really good place to demonstrate socks. Yeah, you had clothing competitions, but a sock doesn't do really well against a dress, no matter what period dress it is. Right. And there was the like needlework competition. But, you know, while a sock, particularly a null-bound sock, is needlework because it is worked with an eyed needle, you know, it's never going to win a competition against the cold and silver and shiny silk stuff. It just isn't. However, they usually had slightly more space. Well, they had less space, but slightly more prominent space. So I would put one sock with the clothing display, and that's where I'd put the documentation, i.e. the book with the Post-it note in it. That's where I would put the documentation. And then I would take the other sock and I would make a hole right in the middle of all the gold and shiny and embroidery stuff. And I would stand the sock upright because all of it was laying flat on the table. And I would stand the sock upright so it like stood up with a little 3x5 card that says, if you want to see the documentation, find the other sock. But at about 2 years in, I started to realize that the surface texture of my socks and my hats and whatever I was building, the surface texture that I was creating was not matching the surface texture of the objects themselves. And all of a sudden I wanted to know why I'm null binding, right? It should look like the null binding, but it doesn't quite look like the null binding. Why does it not quite look like the null binding? So I started actually reading the instructions and reading the documentation and looking closer at the pictures and looking at the diagrams and working out the different types of stitches there were and figuring out why the stitch that I had learned was not quite the stitches that I was seeing in the historical record. So this picture here is one of the first objects where I'm testing out a historical stitch. And being so excited that it's working. And now I have to show everybody else how this one works and I need to teach it. So I prepared to teach, and I signed up to teach at Penzic. I was going to teach people how to null bind the Osler mitten stitch. Oh, by the way, welcome to null binding, beginning null binding. Let's do the Osler mitten stitch. It works. If they don't know any better, they don't know it's hard.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's not actually that much harder than mom, and it's just a little different. It's okay. Um, and so I was so excited to do that, and I was getting ready to do that. Can you flip to the next slide? So what happened was I did that. I was going and prepping to do it, but what I was also doing was going to college, and I had gotten the opportunity to apply for a scholarship to go study in Taiwan for a year. And I got told that I was going to be third on the waiting list. And I was like, okay, I am not going, because it involved paying your plane tickets, it involved paying your tuition and your books and your fees and a small living stipend. I'm like, I'm third on the waiting list. There is no way I'm going. Well, I get this phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning, because of course it's the Department of Education on the East Coast that's calling me at 9:30 in the morning saying, oh, by the way, I thought you should know I put your package in the mail today. You're going to Taiwan if you want to go.
Yay.
Oh, what? All of a sudden, I figured out why it was that people who are third on the waiting list might get to go, because putting your entire life on hold for a year is hard. And I had 10 days to do it, because I had already bought my plane tickets out to Penzig, because I was going back to go see my Loch Mary and my boyfriend. And I this was the time frame I was supposed to be writing the handout for my new class, but I couldn't, because I had to prepare for Taiwan. So I teach the class. I say, I promise you that I will write you a handout. I got to get to Taiwan. I'm going to get out of Penzig. I leave a little early. I go home. I'm home for 48 hours and I head to Taiwan. Quite amusingly, I spent my 9 months in Taiwan. I spent a month traveling mainland China, which we'll get to. I go visit my grandparents on the way home, and then I'm home for 48 hours before I go to Penzig again. It's a great year. But in doing so, I'm like, I want to write them a handout, but because it's coming late, I want to write them a really good handout, not just a little sketch. I want to write them a really good handout. And so I had taken with me photocopies of the bibliography pages out of all of the books. I couldn't bring all the books. I didn't have the weight or the space. But I brought the bibliographies in the pertinent small parts. And so I started reading what I had in the pertinent small parts, and I used the bibliography. I cut it out and pasted it so it was in alphabetical order, so it was easier for me to use in the library. And I went to the Academia Sinica, which is the big academic library in Taipei. And they have an amazing ethnographic section and archaeology section. And as long as you can work your way through the Chinese card catalog, you can get to the books in English.
Wow.
So it's there that I got my copy of Pfister and Bellinger's 1945, I think, 1945, 15, anyway, 40s, 50s, I can't quite remember the exact publication date, for their report on the Dura Europus textiles. I'm like, I'm in Taiwan and I'm getting this British publication on Syrian textiles in English. Yeah, it's great. So that's where I started. I ended up building the Osla mitten stitch. So my handout ended up becoming the first instruction manual I wrote, because I wanted it to be all the data. And then I also started working out the structural pattern, how to actually recreate the Dura Europus fragment. I spent a lot of time staring at really bad photos to try and work that out stitch by stitch, because it's stitch patterned, cross knit and cross purl in null binding. And I made my first regularized pattern there. Next picture, because I'm going to run behind if I don't keep going. So while I'm in Taiwan, I also take a couple of cultural classes. I learned how to do brush painting. Clearly calligraphy was taken after the brush painting, not before. Next picture. I also took paper cutting, which was really, really cool. And they start you out by paper cutting snowflakes. I'm like, oh, I know how to do this, except I didn't know how to fold into 3s and 4s and 5s.
They're just beautiful.
And so I got to play with that, and it was just so much fun. You'll note the Lochmary crabs. Next picture. So I eventually took one of those, slapped it on this cute little box, and decided that it needed a little more oomph. And this box here, many years after this process, but I put it here because it's right next to the paper cuts where I made it, is okay. I always thought I couldn't paint. Maybe I'm not so bad at it. I mean, I thought it was like one of those things I could not do, right? Okay. All right, maybe I'm not so bad at it. Maybe I can figure that out. Next. So I'm in Taiwan, and China's a long way away from the West Coast where I lived at the time, and it's a long way away from the East Coast where I live now. So when was I ever going to get this close to China again? And by this point, Elizabeth Whalen Barber's book about the mummies of Urumqi was out, and it was just all the rage and really fascinating stuff. That had happened before I left for Taiwan. I'd been keeping up with people about null binding by starting the first e-groups null binding list, which eventually became a Yahoo null binding, email group list, and was pretty much the place to get information if it wasn't in German, because there was a German list as well that came up later. But I started with the English list first, and for like 10 years, the archives are pretty fascinating.
Wow.
But anyway, so I came from there, and I was in Taiwan, and I'm like, I really, China's like just over there. Just over there. I could go. I should probably go. So I did. I dropped my fourth quarter, and I hopped on a plane. I bought a plane ticket to Hong Kong because I couldn't buy a plane ticket into mainland China, not from Taiwan. I couldn't get a mainland China visa in Taiwan. But I could get to Hong Kong. So I flew to Hong Kong, and I had a plane ticket that was leaving Hong Kong in a month. And I crossed my fingers and said all kinds of good words, pretty please, let's make this work, to actually get my visa, because I could not afford to live in Hong Kong for a month. We get out of there. I got the visa, and I got on a train to head towards Beijing. And I did not know exactly where I was going to go on this trip until about 3/4 of the way through.
Wow.
Each bit was kind of planned as I went along. I knew I wanted to go to Urumqi because I wanted to see the hat. I decided I wanted to go to Kashgar because I wanted to go to one of the open air Sunday markets that I was unlikely to be able to go to anywhere else. So I really wanted to do that. So I knew those things, but I didn't know when or how I was going to get there. And it's me and the guidebook and time. So I took the train from Hong Kong to Beijing, which is about 29 hours in the hard sleepers. So there's 3 bunks in a room. It's one of the few ones that was actually air conditioned. And one of my bunkmates was actually a lady from Sweden. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And so we got to chatting in Swedish, and we got to Beijing, and neither of us had figured out a hotel. So we found the hotel, we chose one, we went to go get it, and we went to go find it. And because she was there, I actually worked out and figured out, okay, how to get the bus schedule and how to walk and follow the map and do the thing. Because if she hadn't have been there, I'd have been lazy and I'd have called a cab. But because she was there, I actually used the language skills that I had. So we'll try this. Okay. And of course, I only spoke so well. I mean, I've been in Taiwan for a little while, so that helped a little bit, but I'm still kind of, it's still kind of foreign to me. And of course, in Beijing, they speak Mandarin as their native tongue. And so, yeah, I survived. It was good. We had a great time. We went up to the Great Wall. We went to the Forbidden City. We did all kinds of cool and interesting touristy things. We asked them for where to have dinner, and they told us about this little restaurant that you went across the street, past the abandoned hotel, down the dark alleyway, around to the back side of it, and there was this little restaurant with like no English in the menu at all. So I ended up ordering Kung Pao chicken because it was about the only thing I could read on the menu. And oh my God, absolutely the most amazing Kung Pao chicken I have ever eaten in my life. And we went back again for the next night because it was so good. But otherwise we had a great time. And then she was going to go visit her friend was coming to see her. So I went off and started across. So I took the train and I was kind of vaguely heading towards Lanzhou. And I decided that I wanted to go to Inner Mongolia. And on the train was one of the few times they managed to convince me to take a tour, and I'm kind of glad I did. I normally don't like to allow people to convince me to take tours randomly because they ran up to me, but in this case, it worked out pretty well. So I got to ride a camel on the dunes of Inner Mongolia, and we stayed out in some permanent yurts and had a meal. I got drunk for one of the first times. Well, it was the second time in my life. I was now 21. It was the second time, but none of them on the continental contiguous US. So I got drunk, and I also, and we did a lot of swing dancing, which was quite entertaining. And I went to bed sober, and I woke up going, aren't I supposed to have a hangover?
Aw.
Well, what happens is there's a Mongolian welcome ceremony that they do. It's for the tourists, but they do it anyway. And it involves drinking a cup of baijiu, which is like 56% alcohol. You either drink or you don't drink in China. There is no I do but lightly. You either flat out don't drink, and they'd best not find out that you do, or you drink. So I decided, okay, I'll take the drink, and I downed the welcome cup of baijiu, having performed a little ceremony, which was really cool. But I did it early because I knew that I needed food, because I hadn't had food and water in like 6 hours, and I'm used to eating every 3. So I was fading fast. And I immediately asked for more tea, which was milk tea, which is salty. This is odd to me. There was butter in that. But I needed liquids, so down it went. I ate mostly rice for dinner that night. So I did that, and they're all like, oh my goodness, the white girl drinks. So the guy that I was traveling with a tour group, and most of the tour group was built up of this Chinese supervisor and his employees, because the Chinese do not travel by themselves, and they seem to go out in work groups sometimes. And so they were going on this tour as a work group, and I was by myself, and that is not done. Just not done. Now, when they couldn't tell that I could speak Chinese, this white face does not look like it should. They kind of, in order to preserve face, both for them and for me, would pretty much pretend I didn't exist. They can't offend me and I can't offend them if we just move around like ghosts around each other. But as soon as they figured out I could talk, oh my God, you can't be by yourself. That just isn't done. So they took me under their wing, and this was really, really great, excepting that I've now just downed a cup full of baijiu, and the supervisor of the group that took me under their wing comes over and wants to toast me with another 2 fingers worth of 56% alcohol. And I cannot refuse. Uh-oh. I don't have any food in my stomach. Uh-oh. But it worked out all right. We had a great night. It was loads of fun. And we moved on. So that happened. I get on the train, and the train from Beijing to the Inner Mongolia place, to Lanzhou. I unfortunately, not Lanzhou, for Huhohalta. I went from Beijing to Huhohalta. So that particular train, one of the other things that happened to me was an unfortunate sexual harassment incident, which was highly unusual in China, because usually there are so many people around that nobody will let anybody do that kind of crazy thing. But at 3 a.m, you know, so I was a little nervous about getting back on the train, and I did not want a bottom bunk. And the tour group was reserving the train bunks. And I'm like, please don't give me a bottom bunk. They're like, everybody wants a bottom bunk. I'm like, oh no, I want to be way up high and safe. Thank you. No. Well, what did they get me? They got me the bottom bunk. I was not happy. And I'm riding along, and I'm trying to keep myself busy and kind of keep people from crowding too much, because I'm used to a little more personal space. So I started spinning. I had brought a drop spindle and some wool with me, and I started spinning. And these girls on the train are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I don't know how to explain this in Chinese. I've never tried to explain how to spin thread in Chinese, I says. And this guy comes over, and he goes, oh, Fang Xian. I'm like, what? Yeah, it's that easy? Because what that literally means is make thread. What? Oh, okay. I guess I did know how to say what I was doing. So and why is it that you know this? Well, it turns out that his family was in one of the families at it's a factory, but it's not really a factory, business, was that they took kivyut fiber and cashmere fiber in from the farms and processed it and sold it and sent it off to the east to get spun and sent out. So he convinced me that I should go to Xining with him and go see these things. And so I stayed with his not his direct family, his niece and nephew, his sister-in-law and his niece and nephew, up in the offices of that building. And I got to see a tower of cashmere, raw cashmere, that was like 2 stories high in this building.
Wow.
Huge. It was massive. We got to go see a whole bunch of cool things. It was loads of fun. It involved getting drunk for the second time outside of the States. And that's the end. I'm done. I've only been drunk 3 times in my life, and twice were in mainland China. And I knew that one was coming, though. So I also drank large quantities of fruit juice and water. So again, no hangover. So I left from there, and I went up to Urumqi, arrived at like 7 o'clock in the morning.
Which is way up in here, right?
Yeah, it's that pointy bit. It's that bit right there. Yes. That's Urumqi up there at the tip of that bit. So I arrived in Urumqi. Now this has been like 35 hours on the train. Each one of these lumps is like 35 hours on the train. Wow. I love taking the train. I really, really love taking the train. And I hadn't been able to take the train in a very long time. And so I thought this was going to be great. I'm going to take the train. I'm going to see the scenery. Well, what I forgot is that ever since I was a small child, you put me in a vibrating vehicle and I fall asleep. So I'm like, this is so great. I'm going to see the scenery. I had the most rested vacation ever.
Nice.
Because 35 hours on a train, and I'm having trouble staying awake for more than 3 or 4 at a time. I got to see a lot of scenery. I really did, but I also slept through a lot of scenery. We get up to Urumqi. It's like 7 o'clock in the morning. I go to find the museum. I go into the museum. We explore it. If you go to the next slide, this is the museum. Found the museum. Went in to go see the hat, and it's in this display cabinet, and it's far enough away from the glass that I can tell it's not knitting, but I can't tell what it is. And so I reach out and I ask, is it possible for me to be able to examine the hat? I know it's on display, but is it possible for me to be able to examine the hat? And they said, well, no, not right now. But we can arrange for that to work. And I'm like, well, I can be back in a week because I want to go out to Kashgar for the Sunday markets and I can be back. And they're like, okay, yeah, we'll do that. There was some questions about university affiliation and some monetary exchange for the photograph rights to take the photographs. But yes, we can do that. So I go off to Kashgar, have a marvelous and wonderful time, come back from Kashgar, having nearly died of dehydration. I lost 20 pounds, 15, 20 pounds, like in less than a week, probably in less than 48 hours. I had stayed up the night before. So you're up in the Taklamakan Desert. Can we go back one slide?
Sure.
So we'd taken the train from Urumqi across the upper edge of the Taklamakan Desert. It's hot and I'm in a metal box. And the only cooling is like the windows open, which lets all the sand in. And it's dry. It's dry heat. So it's actually pretty comfortable, but you don't realize how much fluid you're losing. So if I was awake, I was drinking enough, but I also needed to sleep to retain some of it. So I wasn't necessarily drinking enough while I was awake. I ended up staying up all the way through one night, the day before I was to travel back. And I was getting on the train to go back to Urumqi and the train leaves at midnight. So I hadn't slept the night before. I'm doing all my packing, having recently bought a rug that I am now going to cart back across mainland China on a train. And I'm going to get back. And so I didn't sleep that night. I probably didn't drink enough water. I get on the train at midnight. I go to sleep. I did not wake up until 5 p.m. the next day.
Wow.
And I woke up going thirsty, snooze. Water, snooze. Do I have any? Snooze. Yes, snooze. And, you know, off and on, like every word between, yes, I have it. It's in my backpack. I should get it. Let me reach back there. Let me snooze. Let me grab the bottle, snooze. Let me bring it to the front of me, snooze. Let me open the bottle, snooze. Take a sip, snooze, until I managed to get about a cup's worth of water into me. And that finally woke me up enough that I could get up, and I actually did have to go to the bathroom. And I got up, I got down, I came back up, and I said something to my cube mates, you know, in the carriage, and they're like, oh, you can talk. Like before this, they were not going to talk to me because, like, you know, I explained that already. But they found out I could talk, and they're like, you sure do sleep a long time. And I'm like, and because you didn't know I could talk, you were going to let me die up there. Because you didn't know how to wake me.
Wow.
Right. But I ended up losing like 15 pounds because we'd weighed me in Sheening the week before, you know, and I weighed myself when I got back. I ended up losing 15, 20 pounds. I didn't gain them back for another 6 months. Not the way to do it. Don't do that. So I get back to Urumqi at like 7 o'clock in the morning again. And I go to see the hat. So yes, next slide. After this one, there we are. I go see the hat, and they hadn't pulled it out yet. And I'm like, I'm here. You said I could examine the hat. And they're like, oh, right, yes. Well, they had built better displays than they had when Elizabeth Whalen Barber was there the first time. And so it was in this really nice display hall, big long room with the display cabinets starting about waist high and going up, and, you know, being, I don't know, 2 feet deep all the way across the room. The hat is the third object from the left. The only access into the display cabinets is all the way on the far right. So I got to watch the guy walk carefully over all of the exhibits, trying not to step on anything, to pick up the hat and walk backwards because there wasn't enough room to turn around.
The cow.
Out of the exhibit without stepping on anything. And then they brought it over, and as you can see in the picture, they put the hat on Chinese newsprint. If you know anything about Chinese newsprint, it's that the ink doesn't stick to the paper very well.
Oh my.
So I have gloves on, but I did not touch that object. I was not going to be responsible for that part. I mean, I was already responsible enough for it coming out. I was not going to be responsible for testing it. I was also woefully unprepared. This is only the second extant object that I had actually gone to go see. The first one had been that summer before I went off to China. I went to Sweden with my mother, and we went to the Statens Historiska Museet, and I asked to see their 14th century null binding. And they said they had some, so they showed it to me, and I've got fragments of it, bits and pieces, and I got to see the Laurels glove, mitten. It's a mitten, Laurels mitten, which is now actually back in Laurels, which is near Göteborg, near Gothenburg. But at the time was in Stockholm in the Statens Historiska Museet, and I got to see another very felted one, like probably can't figure out how it was made. What I did not get to see was the Oslo mitten, which was also in the museum at the same time, but because I'd asked for 14th century null binding and they thought it was 2nd century at the time, they didn't bring it out.
Oh.
Note to self: be very broad in your descriptions of what you would like to see. You also need to be very specific. It's a very fine balance, because if you aren't specific enough, like to the inventory number about what you want to see, a lot of times they won't let you come and see the thing because they don't, want to waste their time because you don't know what you're looking for. But you can also get yourself in situations where you asked to see that object and they had these other similar objects that you didn't know existed and you didn't get to see because you didn't ask for them. So it's an interesting balance. You have to take care with that. So this is not the only hat. This hat in Urumqi is not the only hat that they have. Of course, the man was found with like a dozen and change to begin with. This is the null-bound one. He had a lot of felt ones and other things. There is another null-bound hat in that area and time frame. It's called the witch's hat, and it's shaped much like that, excepting that it also has a felt cone that comes out the middle of it that ties on, and it also has a null-bound cover on it as well, simple looping and loop and twist alternating patterns. This is simple looping with increases in 4 spaces, and it is shaped by spacing patterns. So it's 4 tight simple loop stitches and then a space, and then 4 tight simple loops stitches in a space. So while it only has 4 separate actual increases, each one of those spaces that gets added in there is also acting as an increase. But that's what gives it that quartered raid look to it.
Interesting.
So I got to see the hat. That was really cool. I wrote to my mom as soon as I got to a computer, which I think was when I got back to Sheening, about it with my first notes and out to the null binding list with my first notes about seeing about it. And at some point I should publish up my notes, but they're fairly minimal because of the fact that it was one of the first objects I ever got to see, and I still didn't know what I was looking at the time. I knew enough to know what it was in null binding and to be able to be certain of the stitch, but I got distracted and forgot to bring my ruler and several other things. So
did you get to see?
I did have them turn it over.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I only got to examine this one up close. I did get them to turn it over so I could see the braided edge on the felt roll. Really fascinating. I want to know how that works. I also got to see a bunch of the other hats on display. There were 2 hats that might meet the description of what Elizabeth Whalen Barber called the onion dome hats, excepting that they're not null bound. they appear to be twined, like twined weave, you know, sort of almost a basketry sort of function. But there's two of them. One's darker than the other one. And then there's the witch's hat, and then this one. There were a number of other ones there, and of course the mummies themselves, including the small child and David with his really fancy socks.
So cool.
And it was great. It was a really amazing trip. I made it back home. I stopped by Xi'an on the way back, and I got to see the clay warriors in the pits, which was just, I did not realize how impactful that was going to be. I had seen the clay warriors before when they had come to Seattle. So they brought like 4 of them to Seattle to show, and I had seen them before. But to see them actually in the pits and realize how broad that space is was intense.
Wow.
All right. So there are a lot of other stories, and I know you wanted to hear about this one, so I spent more time on it, but I got it.
Thank you.
I gotta go. So I came back from Taiwan. I had told you I did the 48 hours, you know, Penzing 48 hours fly to Taiwan, and then the take my route back, which involved 3 weeks in Hawaii, 2 of which I was finishing up the Osla mitten stitch, and the third one where I was going and doing holiday things, you know, touristy stuff, because my friend who I was staying with is like, if you don't go do some touristy stuff, people are going to ask you how was Hawaii, and you're going to say, I was in Hawaii. Get out of the house, he says. Yes. You know, so I enjoyed that. I went and visited my grandparents, who I hadn't seen, of course, in a year. So I went down to California to see my dad's mom, and I took the train up to see my mom's mom in Oregon, and then mom picked me up from there and drove me home. I was home for 48 hours. I turn around, I go to Penzing. I come back from Penzing, and this is, I believe, September Crown, which would be September Crown 2000.
Okay.
Which is really kind of my first event back. I've been out of kingdom for a year. Not only have I been out of kingdom, I have been out of the known world for a year. And they give me my Jambe de Lion.
Awesome.
Dudes, I've been gone. Like not just out of kingdom, I've been gone.
They were waiting.
Well, they were partially waiting, and also, to tell the truth, a lot of people didn't realize I was gone, because it was just the beginnings of like people really using the internet and the e-groups, and so we were communicating by email. People had been hearing about null binding and me and null binding like all year long. I'd been talking to people about null binding, you know, and so for a lot of people, it made no difference to them whatsoever whether I was, you know, on the other side of the mountains or whether I was on the other side of the ocean. You know, it really didn't make a difference, but it was a shocker to me. So this is my display. And you can see I'm starting to actually get more books. You know, that first display only had like a book and a binder and stuff, and now you can see there's a lot more books on the table. Up here in the kind of right hand side of the corner, there's actually a couple of pictures from that when I was in Statens Historiska Museum. So there's a couple of the 14th century, in the middle row, those two are actual photographs of the 14th century objects I got to see in Stockholm. I'm wearing my Uyghur hat that I got when I was in Kashgar, and the veil that I got when I was in Kashgar. Yeah, so I was having fun talking about null binding stuff. It was great. Next picture.
Wow.
Close up of some of the stuff I was working on at the time. So there's the yellow mitten. I finished it. You know, you saw the yellow mitten earlier where I'd been working on it, and a couple of pairs, and I've been experimenting with stripes and textures, and that little white kind of roughly bit in the middle there is me working out the Dura Europus pattern. And on the right-hand side, I've like cut one so you can see what it looks like and cut. That's the other white thing in the bottom right-hand corner. Next. So me wearing another Uyghur hat. This one's got fur, and in fairly typical garb for me at the time. I wore the daylights out of those tunics. I still have them and I still wear them occasionally if it gets cold enough. And that's my mom next to me in the dress I helped fit for her, in the Italian rent I fitted for her. Next. Okay, so while I was in Taiwan, you could get silk. I bought silk. While I was in mainland China, I bought a lot of silk and I brought it home for people. But one of the pieces I got for myself was this beautiful green with this black all over patterning on it. And there was only just like 1 yard available. And I managed to hand sew up for myself and make, this is one I bought in Taiwan, not in mainland China, make myself an actual bodice with like peplums. And I hand sewed that darn thing. Getting your fingers and a needle through brocade woven silk is not easy.
It's difficult. Yeah.
And I am very sad that I am no longer that shape or size. Next. Okay, so this particular picture, this is the Weaving Works in Seattle, and they decided to have a sock display. And they're like, would you like to contribute to the sock display? And I'm like, well, my socks aren't knit. And they're like, no, that's really cool. We would love to have some not knit socks. That would be great for our lots of socks exhibition. And so like 2/3 of, no, one third of the socks in that picture are mine.
So this one,
that one, the big long one, the 3 in the top, well, the 3 in the top left and the yellow one below them. And there's one more that's hiding that you can't really see. Let's see if I had a piece of it around here earlier. Maybe I can figure out what I did with it.
That's super cool. I wonder how many people like really looked at them and thought, what kind of stitch is that?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. We had great fun setting it up. They enjoyed it. You can see I'm not too long back from Taiwan because you'll note the jacket. And I just had a lot of fun with that. It was really fun being able to put that up. And I love the knitted Christmas sock to the far left. I think it's just the most beautiful thing, but nonetheless. So this is down.
Sorry.
A little too far. There you go. So this is down in Rivers region.
This
just
was a Kingdom ANS.
Yeah, maybe. No, not a Kingdom ANS. No, this is a guild fair. This was a guild fair that they held. And if I went and go look it up on my screen, I could remember what it was. Anyway, it was a guild fair. And so different guilds were bringing their stuff out to show everybody. And I'm like, I'm only one person, but I could fill a table. And they're like, yes, bring out the null binding. So I did. So all the null bindings in the middle, and you'll notice that the paperwork has started to expand. So, you know, each time you see a display, there's like more paperwork to go with it. And I had the world's worst migraine, like all day long. I had the migraine setting. It hit me just as I was setting up. I was like half set up and the migraine slammed into me, and you can kind of see it on my face if you know me from there. It cleared up briefly for about to barely tolerable for about 2 hours in the middle of the day, which thank goodness is right around the time when the judges came by. Because what happened was, this is a guild display. I brought my stuff to display, and they're like, but we're having an ANS competition as well. Would you like to enter an item in the ANS competition? And I'm like, not really. And they're like, please enter an item in the ANS competition. By the way, don't ever do that to anybody. It's terrible. Don't do that. They're not prepared. The judging forms are not prepared for it. Do not do it. The fact that I won has nothing to do with this. Don't do that to people. And so we get here, and I'm like, I am not making the decision. Okay, fine. I will enter your competition, but you have to pick the object, because no brain. And they're like, I pick the whole table. I'm like, do you know what you're doing to your judges? That's no, bad, pick one. And they're like, whole table. And I'm like, okay. Is what is. So the judges came over and got nice 3 judges, and we had good conversations about the stuff. And they're all kind of, this is really hard to try and like judge multiple objects, that aren't quite, anyway. I got 2 really good scores and 1 quite reasonable score that was not anywhere near the same amounts. Thank you, Kat. But it was real. and for valid reasons that I thoroughly understood. And I was still absolutely floored and shocked when they presented me with a really beautiful hand-painted scroll for having won the ANS that day.
Wow.
I what? Huh? Because again, migraine, court, bad.
Yeah.
Mom was there, thank God, saved my butt, packed me up, and we went home. But it was pretty cool, and I was glad to come out and do it. I really was. Next slide. So eventually all that paperwork caught up to me. And having started playing in the SCA truly out in Atlantia, I was more of an Eastern Rite type person than a Western Rite type person. And so I really, by this point, I had a Laurel. Fiac and I had discussed a couple of years before this. We came back from July coronation, and as we're driving home, I'm like, Fiac, if you get Laurel first, can I be your apprentice? And he's like, yeah, sure, as long as like if you get Laurel first, I get to be your apprentice. And 3 weeks later, they're treating me like his apprentice a whole like 8 hours before he becomes a Laurel, because I'm like the one sent to go like run around and do the things to make it happen. It was quite funny. So anyway, I've been Fiac's apprentice for a couple of years now, and he also came from the East, and so understood this. And I really, really, really did not want the writ, we're going to put you on vigil and it'll be another 3 months or so down the road, because I really could not see making my way through the whole proto-peer period. That just seemed terribly awkward to me, and I knew I would not be comfortable in it. And so I had asked Fiac if there was any way possible that if they decided to elevate me to Laurel sometime in the future, would it be possible for me to have more of an Eastern Rite? They put you on vigil in the morning and they elevate you in the evening. Well, this is a little tricky because Antier doesn't usually have 2 courts in the same day, or even 2 courts in back to back overnight, but this is the crowning of the Prince and Princess of Thierry, and I think it's the first one. It was in 2003, November of 2003. And the story starts on Monday. So on Monday, I leave my house. On Tuesday, I leave my house. I'm going to work, having packed my overnight bag because I know I'm going to get flooded out of my house. The house will be fine, but the dead end road that gets to my house is going to be flooded. It's raining. It's Western Washington. It's, it's November. It's going to do that. And well, where do I go when that happens? I'm going to go stay with my Laurel because he's on a hill at 500 feet. So I'm going to go stay at his house. I call him up and say, hey, I'm getting flooded out of the house. Can I come stay with you? And he's like, well, I'm not home. I'm over at Kistenen's at his metalworking shop. I'm like, oh, Tuesday night metalworking that I have never managed to be able to go to. Can I come? They're like, yeah, sure, come on. So I come down there, and he's working on some medallions, and he has me cutting out the circles for this medallion, and he's got his brand new little leaf stamp, and he's stamping it up, and he's like, so what do you think of this one? I'm like, you can't have all the leaves pointing to the absolute center. That's not how a wreath works. They kind of stagger up, right? And he's giving Kistenen all of this Laurel-y advice because Kistenen is in the middle of his proto-peer time. He was on vigil. And, Stennon kept having to go out and take smoke breaks because unbeknownst to me, my Laurel was giving Laurely advice to both of us. And Kastenin knew he was because Tamlin was in his house working on my Laurel scroll at that time.
Nice.
So my Laurel had to leave and go talk to her and do Laurely business for a while. And I'm just happily sitting here cutting out Laurel medallion blanks. No, I did not actually cut out my own Laurel medallion blank. That was number 4. I only cut out 1 through 3. But I came very close. And it was great fun. And then we go back to his house, and guess what? I get snowed in. It snows. So I get flooded out of my house one night. I get snowed into his house. He's got this brand new cuckoo clock, and it's too bloody cold. And so I didn't get much sleep that night, which meant that I woke up the next morning and I started having another fibromyalgia flare up. Okay, this is not good. Frank came and picked me up and took me home, and I didn't go to work on Thursday because I was in a full fibromyalgia flare up. And the only thing that I had any energy to do was to desperately attempt to defend my sourdough bread from my Cutis Maximus kitten, who was bound and determined to steal it from me. And that was about it. I'm curled up in my bed trying to desperately stay warm and sleep. I decide on Friday, I haven't been at work since Tuesday. I really need to go back to work. I'm going to try. I have the weekend to recover. I know my Laurel wants me to go up to Thierry's investiture because he wants me to meet his new student. No, I can't do this. I physically can't do this. I go to work. At my break time is when I usually went to the library to go check my email. And I was like, do I want to do that? Because that means I have to walk outside in the cold. I'm like, but I haven't checked my email since Tuesday. So I go check my email. And my Laurel wrote a note to his student on the apprentice group that we had together. And it said, do you have room in your hotel room for a vigil? Went right over my head. No, and she's like, no, I've got other people staying with me. I don't think there's going to be any room. Went right over my head. He's like, that's okay. I'm not sure when they're going to put Sigrid on vigil. And I'm like, uh-oh, shit. I have to be social tomorrow. I'm not going to be able to be social tomorrow if I finish this workday. So I went in and said, I got to go home. I don't feel well. I still don't feel well. And I got to go home. I went home. I did some shopping on the way. I get home about 1:30 in the afternoon. And Frank looks at me and he's like, so, why are you home? And I hand him the printout of the email. And he's like, right. What do we need to pack? What do I have to pack for you to help you get there? And so I go. And so I had my Laurel in the middle of a fibromyalgia flare up. I got my Jean de Leon in the middle of a fibromyalgia flare up. I got my Laurel in the middle of a fibromyalgia flare up, like a really bad one. So each time it took about a week to fully sink in. Next picture. So here I am, freshly minted with my certificate that says it's real, which I'll need because it's not sinking in yet. The king had a lot of fun going, look, it's you, and it's me, and it's you, and it's me. And if I knew so they grew on trees, which is the other picture she did, was me sitting underneath a tree with like little mittens and socks hanging off the branch. And he's like, well, if I knew they grew on trees. Next picture. So my mom and I had gone places and looked at things, and I had talked about, it's important for people to have their own livery. So my device, my arms are an inverted henning a knot, a serpent in an inverted henning a knot with an aureole of birch leaves around it. And so my mother made a heraldic tabard with the aureole of birch leaves around it. And this is particularly special to me because I actually helped Mom working on it while we were in the hospital, while my grandmother was kind of in the hospital for the last time. So it's a special piece to me. as Mom and I were working on it, sitting in the hospital hallway. Futzing. I've used it many times. You might see it pop up, or I may have cut those photographs out. Next. So in 2002, before I was Laurel, I went to my first International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I presented my first paper on null binding. Scared to death because I had no idea what I was doing, but it went over really well. Everybody loved it. And this is actually 2004 when I went back to fill in. They had a last minute cancellation a month out, and they were saying, does anybody have any research that's ready enough that they can put together a 20-minute paper in a month? I can. Hey, Mom, do you want to go back to Michigan? She's like, yeah, sure, let's go. So here I am trying to look all adult like. And this is actually not the presentation itself, but here we are talking about various null binding spits. Next page. And this was also the year that Distaff started their displays, their museum type displays. And so this is my null binding of the world, starting with some simple looping from the Bronze Age lake dwellings, Neolithic, Bronze Age, I'm not quite sure, long time ago. From the lake dwellings up through the mummies of Urumqi hat, up into a bunch of the Egyptian socks, top and bottom. Then you get the York sock and the Oslo mitten, and a sock from Arizona from the 13th century, and the Lund mitten, and another hat from Egypt. Which is one of the interesting hats. It's been recently carbon dated, so about the 12th century, and it actually has a compound stitch in the body of the hat, and then that tassel part before the real tassels start is 2-color cross-knit looping pattern. And then you've got the slightly pre-14th century sock from Uppsala, and the 14th century gloves of Pierre de Corpelay, and Peter von Corpelay. You hear his name differently, but they're French. And the Spanish glove from Burgos, also the same time frame, 14th century. And then the Oslo mitten, which by this time we knew had been carbon dated and was from the 16th century. Well, 15. Wow. Late 16th into early 17th, which is a big change from its pollen dating of 200 BC, of the first centuries AD. But it fits much better into the shaping that fitted and shaped cuff. It's not the cuff. There's this fancy term for it, but I can't think of it right now. But that shaping is much more 16th century. Next. So I think this is actually back in 2002 where we were having, the group gathering for Distaff from my first presentation, and people wanted to talk about stuff. So I drug stuff out of my backpack, and we're all sitting on the floor because there's you can see a table in the background, but it's like occupied with like food and drink. I'm not allowed to put stuff on it. So we're all there on the floor with our munchies, flipping through my big book of null binding pictures and looking on the little computer and poking about, and that actually kind of inspired some of the displays that they did later, because we all had so much fun just hanging out on the floor. Next. So 2004 was also the year that I wrote my second instruction manual called Null Binding Made Easy. Both of them, while the first one has drawn diagrams, in 2004, I got a decent camera and I could actually take photographs of it. A lot of the instruction manuals that were written and still are written today have a certain style to their diagrams that unfortunately kind of requires an understanding of null binding before you learn how to do it, because they generally show you your thumb in working position as you're looking down on the top edge of it and possibly on the nail side of it. Most of the actual null binding work when you're working on your thumb is done on the technical back, on the pad side of your thumb, which is of course away from your face. So they, they don't show, they show you kind of what you need to pick up, but they don't show you what you need to leave behind. And that always frustrated me. And so all of mine, I have either they're drawn this way or there's a photographs with both the regular working position and the, oh my God, I'm lost. Get my elbow up and rotate my hand so that I can look straight at the pad of my thumb and I can see what the heck is going on. So, eye of the needle is to the top right, tip of the needle is the bottom left here. We are looking at the back side of the fabric so I can see what's going on. Next picture. And this is me having worked out how to do 3-color work. So that is a tricolor spiral beret and a tricolor scarf that I did as one big circle and then cut.
Wow.
And this is how you often find me at events, poking through random books, saying, look at this really cool, interesting thing. In this case, it happens to be the Pritzwalker hoard, and I'm talking about decorative hook and eye sets, which if I stand up a little bit, you can see a nice little Billy and Charlie one. So I got fascinated by these decorative hook and eye sets that were found in these hoards. And so there was a bunch of them out of Scandinavia, and then I was finding a bit more out of Germany, and I ended up presenting it at the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo on a subject that wasn't null binding, because I couldn't stop being fascinated by these things. And it was great fun and entertainment. Next picture. So I also got fascinated by the 14th century Brigida relic, the little Brigida cap, fairly early. In fact, actually before the article came out in the Medieval Clothing and Textiles Journal, I had been reading the Swedish article published in the 1960s, which has slightly better photographs of the micro pleating on the pleats, by the way. Pay close attention to that. Most people ignore it. But it had terrible photographs of the lace work down the center. I couldn't figure out how to do that. So this is a much later picture, not of my first one. I cut out the picture of my first one. So this is me working through the actual interlacement of that pattern as described in the Medieval Clothing and Textiles Journal article, because I had a friend who wanted to do it. And, so you just do those things. Yes, let's make another one. They're great fun. I like them. Next.
Beautiful.
So this is me all formal and fancy. This is me all dressed up. My medallion has now made it on a livery chain. The voided silk velvet that I got in Kashgar because it might be needed someday finally got built into a cloak. Yeah. That's actually at Ocean Shores at another 12th night. This is after I had moved back out to the East Coast, but I kept coming home for 12th night for about 10 years. Now we get back into this is not on this continent. So in 2011, well, actually in 2010, I kind of whined to my mom and I said, Mom, there's this conference I really want to go to, and I'm not going to be able to go to. She's like, well, why can't you go to the conference? And I'm like, because it's in Germany, Mom. She's like, but I want to go to Germany. Do you want to go enough that you're willing to pay for 2 plane tickets, Mom? She's like, yes, I think that would be fun. So off we go, and we're going to go to NESAT. Oh my God. So if you've studied null binding, you know that one of the major articles about null binding is Egan Hansen's article in NESAT 3. it is kind of the primary classification system, and it's the beginning description of that. Unfortunately, there was a note in the back of NESAT 3 that he had passed away before the proceedings got finished being published. Very sad. But we're going to go to a NESAT. Oh my goodness. Like, I've read all the NESATs, the fascinating, amazing research, and we're just going to go. It's a 4-day conference on textiles, Northern European Symposium for Archaeological Textiles. And I'm going to go. This is going to be so great. So we're going to go, and it's in Esslingen, Germany, Esslingen am Neckar. And well, if I'm going to fly over to Europe, I am not just going to go for the 4 days for the conference. I'm going to take my 2 weeks that I can take, and I'm going to go see everything else that I can possibly see. Yes, I know, very American attitude towards vacations, but a lot of times that's because I'm bouncing between the backsides of museums. So this is the cathedral in Speyer in Germany. And the museum is to the right by a block, which is where Kaiser Heinrich III's glove, which was found in said cathedral, excuse me, is now located and was on display at the time we went to go see it. Oh my goodness, this almost never happens. It was actually on display, but we were not allowed to take photographs in that particular display. So I cannot show you my photo. Yeah, I cannot show you Kaiser Heinrich III's glove. But what was really impressive of it to me is that I had a book called Dom du Speyer, which laid out all of the cathedral treasures. And the mitten was, the glove was in there, but they had only taken a blown up photograph of a couple of rows with no real scale to it. So I could see the rows and I could see them clearly and distinctly in the picture. I almost missed seeing the glove on display because I didn't recognize it as null binding because the row heights were so tiny, so tiny. It's a null bound glove in silk.
Wow.
Yeah, real silk, like not like, you know, fat chunky knit yarn silk. No, we're talking, you know, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It's pretty impressive and pretty amazing, and it was a great trip. And by the way, this is where I discovered that it can be hot in Germany in May, but you'll walk into one of those big stone buildings and it feels so nice. All right, next picture. All right, so this is at NESAT, and I'm talking to Ulrika Clausen-Buntner in the breaks, and we're discussing bits of null binding and stuff like that. And she shortly after that came out with her book, Null Binding, What in the World Is It? Well, actually, she came out with the German one first, and then she came out with 2 English versions. If you get the English version in the US, you get the black and white version. If you buy it from Amazon in Germany, you can get the color, but in English version.
Interesting.
Worth noting. So I came back from that NESAT. That particular NESAT was the first public presentation of the Lemberg finds, in particular, the Lemberg bras. And that was part of why I really wanted to go to that conference, was because I knew perfectly well that everybody was going to poo-poo that research. They were going to say, oh yeah, somebody looked at the little apple lady illuminations again and has come up with a new theory, blah, blah, blah. It's not real. It can't be. I'm like, no, I'm going to go. I'm going to go listen to the thing. I'm going to see what evidence they present, and I'm going to come back and tell you whether or not. Okay, I think you can fill in the rest of the words there. Or not, as the case may be. And well, it turns out, or not was the truth. They had really good stuff. At the time, they thought more of them were bras than further research has determined. At this point, only one of them is, but they thought they had 3 at the time. 2 of them have now, or at least one of them has been determined to be a hat, and I think the other one is as well. But I came back to Penzic and I'm like, oh my God, this is so great. I have to tell everybody about it. And I realized that talking about it was not going to have the same impact. So here I am in the middle of opening ceremony, stitching away on a bra in public. Nobody knows it's a bra, but I'm stitching away on a bra, but that would explain the little gleeful smirk on the face there. And that I'm going to prep for the Penzic display so that I can help people visualize what we're talking about here. I also have sitting on my knee there one of my toy windmills, my toy pinwheels that I have great fun with, and probably taught at Penzic that year, which is loads of fun. An absolute hour of chaos teaching our random unknown number of unknown age children and adults how to make pinwheels, but then they go test them.
Oh,
and that's fun. And for the next 2 days, you can spot kids playing with pinwheels all over Penzic, and it is like the most fun ever. Next. So this is also a Penzic photograph, one of my favorite Penzic photographs. I took this one myself. So where we live out on what's called the Serengeti, which is a fairly broad, flat plain, off to our left, there's a hill, which is where the parking is. And it's generally behind trees, but it's not very far behind trees. And on top of the hill, they planted one of those big generator 4 lights thing to shine light across the parking area so that you could find your car and not fall down in the hills in the night, and probably to help prevent thefts and whatever. But what it was is meant that shines almost all the time down into our camp, and so we refer to it as the Eye of Sauron. Because it is this big blinding light that sits off in the distance. Well, in this particular time, the trees have grown up big enough, and the clouds came just right in, and it was just this foggy, misty night, and it was just amazingly beautiful. So I had to take the photo, and then I had to show it.
I thought it was the moon.
It was not the moon. That is the Eye of Sauron masking itself. One of the things I like to do at Penzic randomly is carve spoons. So that's one of my spoons that I carved at Penzic.
Wow.
And a friend of mine was getting inducted into the Order of the Pearl, and he's a woodworker. He builds all kinds of things, chairs and weaving implements, random weaving implements, where I show him these cool looms and illuminations, and he goes and makes them for people and stuff, and all kinds of things. And I thought that it would be most appropriate for a woodworker to actually have a wood pearl. So the pearl is the grant level ANS award equivalent to the Champ de Lion. And so I carved his pearl. There it is.
Very cool.
Next. And this is my my first ever bit of leather working. And a friend of mine taught me how to tool leather, and so I put my heraldry on a mug. Next. That's my badge.
Oh, nice.
It's a null-bound mitten. One of these days I'll get the blazon corrected, because that's not a left mitten, that's a right mitten. But next. Okay, so more travels in the world. So a friend of mine, so I moved up to New Jersey for work, and I was only there through the winter. But while I was there, I had a fairly big open house to myself with a big open basement, and I wanted to talk null binding with people, and I was like not near people I knew. So I had a null binding workshop, and I opened it up to like 10 people. You can come crash on my floor, and we'll talk about and work on null binding all weekend. And I had people come from Vermont and New Hampshire, and we had a marvelous time. Well, one of the ladies who came, a year or two later, her husband was on sabbatical in Istanbul. And she's like, you got to come to Istanbul. I'm like, okay, that's just crazy. She's like, no, you got to come to Istanbul. Now, she kept talking to me about null binding because there were these lacy, airy shawls that people were thinking might be null binding because the structure of the looping looked like basic null binding, interconnected null binding. And but the problem with null binding for that is, how do you hide the ends, especially in an open, loose, airy thing? So is it not? And we're trying to get our hands on it. And she's trying to figure out where they originated from. And one of the places she had heard they originated from was Turkey. So she was going to go look. So I was in a lot of communication with her. She's like, you got to come to Istanbul. I'm like, why? Wait a minute. Why wouldn't I go to Istanbul? There's someone there I know. Hey, mom, you want to go to Istanbul? So mom and I go off to Istanbul for a week. And we had a marvelous time. And that is the Hagia Sophia in the background. And
Wow.
me attempting to direct my mother to take a photograph that just shows my head and the Hagia Sophia. She was not supposed to show the arms. You're supposed to put the camera. See, because usually she takes pictures of my tummy. So, I was trying to get up to where, yeah.
It just looks like you're voguing.
Yeah. That was not the photograph that was intended, and it's cute enough. I kept it ever since because I think it's just so funny. Next. So the Hagia Sophia, they tell you in the history books that it is the largest, and was for like a 1,000 years, the largest domed building in existence. I mean, it's been superseded now, but it took forever. There is nothing like standing inside and really realizing what that means. I'm on the second story there.
Wow.
Those are people down there on the floor. It's huge, and it entirely changed my perspective. When I see photographs of the inside of the Hagia Sophia now, and I look at them in a book, it can be just a little tiny photograph that it used to be I would see as a pretty tiny photograph. And now I look at that same little tiny photograph and I still get that same sense of immense size. It entirely changes your perspective.
Wow.
Next picture. So this is down in the cisterns outside. There's a big Medusa head holding up a couple of the bottoms of those. It was just, and there's water and they've got the lights and it's so pretty and it's comfy and cool down there. Oh, it's just beautiful. Next. We didn't even know they existed until we dropped down in there. So here I am in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, and I'm looking at strands of Oya. And the reason I showed this particular picture is that I had heard of the traditional craft of Oya out of Turkey, and that it might be related to null binding, and maybe it was a kind of null binding, but people weren't quite sure, and getting books on it that were in English was not working out really well. So I still wasn't certain. So this was where I got the opportunity to examine a bunch of Oya just in the market, and a lot of it's crochet now. But some of it is still the traditional Oya, and it's a knotting technique. It's knotted needle lace. It's beautiful, but it's knotted. It's not null binding. Close, but not quite. Next. So my mom decided we needed to go out and see the original walls of Constantinople. So we went out and we climbed up on the top of the original walls of Constantinople. This is us coming back down. And you'll notice that my mother had no fear and is already on the ground waiting for me to show up. I'm afraid of heights. Do you see anything remotely useful to grab onto?
Oh, I'd be in your same position, or maybe scooting down that thing on my butt.
Yeah, well, my friend clearly was scooting down on her butt behind me, but yeah. Now, the interesting part is the walls are broad enough that I could stand in the center of the walls and walk and be just fine. No issues whatsoever. They are so wide. But yeah, the getting up and more importantly, the getting back down again was very difficult. So the other thing to note here is that's a set of stairs. It's a very big set of stairs, right? Something you should know about my mother is if there is a tower in town that we're visiting, we will be climbing up it. Like all of it. Like if it's got 400 steps or more, all the better. Did I mention I'm scared of heights?
Oops, I think I skipped one. Sorry.
It's okay. Yes. Oh, yeah, you did. Back again.
There we go. Okay.
There we go. Yes. So one of the other cool things that my friend had managed to get was she had managed to get one of the lacy shawls, and we had managed to talk to the person about the technique and confirm that it is crochet. It's a very loose open crochet, but they're beautiful crochet shawls, and I own one now. But what she had also gotten is a friend of hers had gone to Iran and brought back a pair of traditional Iranian give, which are null bound.
Oh, wow.
And so here we are trying to figure out the structure of the Iranian give. I still need to work at it. It's so dense and so tight. And I haven't wanted to hurt them that, so I've been having to learn more in order to be able to figure out what's going on. But yes, that's very cool stuff. She gave them to me. I still have them. So one of the other things I got to do is a couple of vigil books for people. This is my first book where I got to actually use quarter sawn oak and the wedges to bind the book. My grandmother taught me how to bind my first book when I was 16 and made me bind up the diary she made me take with me to Sweden. So this is in the tradition of what my grandmother taught me, but like better because I read more books. All right. And then this is the back showing what happens with the ropes that, that you bind around with the, well, they weren't ropes. They were actually Todd hide. I can't even think of the right word for it. It's not rawhide. It's anyway, doesn't matter. It's the supports that you sew around. And I made my first ever and only clasp. So proud of myself. All right, next. So I also wanted to try one of the girdle books. And so this is my first attempt at a girdle book and my first attempt at a Turkish knot. And I tooled it a little bit. This was a prize I gave at a competition that I ran on medieval toys. So this was the prize. Next. This is another vigil book that I made for someone. This is a vellum covered ledger book styled after the Italian ledgers, admittedly about a quarter of the size of the original Italian ledgers, but that was the size I had of the vellum, and that was as small as it was going to get, as big as it was going to get, but it was really fun putting together. And that's where I discovered that, I had worked folded books like that before, but always with paper covers, and they worked just fine. And I was nervous about working with real parchment, real vellum, to make the book. And I started working it and I'm like, oh my God, where can I get more of this stuff? It is perfect. It does everything you want it to do. It works exactly like you need it to. And I keep getting reminded that the real tools and the real supplies can make a huge difference in the end product. And you don't have to fight your tools and you don't have to fight your supplies. They spent hundreds and hundreds of years perfecting what was the most appropriate thing to do this out of.
Right.
If you can, and usually the real things are not that much more expensive than the original. And they really shouldn't be scary at all, because usually shifting to period tools makes everything easier. Next. I also made a folding almanac because I ended up being the baronial herald for a while, and I'm terrible with names. It's not just that I can't pronounce various, persona names. It's that I can't remember someone's first name, let alone their whole name. So I need help. And so And I'm also not that sneaky. So trying to figure out how to pronounce someone's name because they're on the court docket today, going to be really, really hard for me. But if I, as the herald, am constantly wandering around asking you, so how do you pronounce your name? No, your full name. And what is your preferred title? To like everybody at the event, I end up being kind of shadowing because I meet all kinds of people that, I didn't know, which includes a whole bunch of new people, which is lots of fun. And then I also have nobody's surprised when the herald is coming by asking how to pronounce your name, because the herald is always coming by asking how to pronounce your name. Are you on my list? Ooh, I don't have you on my list yet. Okay, let's work this down. And it worked out very well. So the page you're currently looking at is the language for the awards, because sometimes it's written on the scroll and something I can read, and sometimes it's not. So this is my I need to know what that text is because I can't read this. So basically it's a walking cheat sheet. It just happens to be in a period styling, and it was loads of fun to do. And I ended up doing it for another herald friend of mine too, because they thought it was great. Next.
Cool.
Period ones tended to be medical texts or religious books. This I threw in there simply because SCA costuming isn't the only thing I do. And I had great fun building wings from whatever's growing in my garden one Halloween.
Awesome.
Next. So I kept going home for 12th nights. And this actually, I think I was going home for the One Kingdom ANS that I went back to Antier for. By wanted to show this picture, besides the fact that for all of my East Coast friends, that's what mountains look like, and those are real trees. Is that they're kind of stubby real trees because we're way up high, but that's the color they're supposed to be. Is that I'm not actually in garb here. I'm technically not in garb. I'm wearing my winter coats because it's cold. Excepting that my winter coats are also my 14th century hupalons. And I chose this picture because the upper one is styled after the G63 in the Hafsness finds out of Greenland. And when it's just a rectangle that you've divided diagonally, except not quite to the points, you're off by just a little bit. So you get these trapezoids. You put them together with the grain lines the way that the original was done, and you get all of those beautiful folds from the shoulder that a hupalon should have, with absolutely no work involved at all. It just does it. Except for having a shaped sleeve cap, which isn't as hard as people think it is sometimes. That's all rectangular construction, and it comes out so easy. More people should do them. They're very cool. And they make great coats, by the way. So this, I came back for Mr. Joran's elevation. I flew across the country to go, and it was great fun. And I was up there, and she was getting elevated, and she turned around. They were going to have speakers at her elevation, and she, other people spoke for her, and she finally turns around and hands me the horn, and she's like, "You flew all this way. You want to say something?" And it was like the first ever elevation ceremony that I actually spoke for someone, and that's the amount of notice I got.
Oh.
So yes, these are fairly recognizable socks. They're on the front of my Null Binding Made Easy manual. They are styled after some of the Egyptian finds. There is a pair of socks in Florence, which it took me a while to realize they were in Florence. But they use this kind of coloring pattern. It's not exactly this. This is me doing what I thought was very similar to what they do, which is I used up the scraps of my yarn. But it was also my first time getting to try out the wedge heel with the short rows and that 45-degree angle on the ankle. And I had a lot of fun putting them together. Next slide. And when we went to Italy, when mom and I went to Italy, she's like, is there any null binding in Italy? And I'm like, I think so. Let's go find out. And yes, in the Museo Egizio, which is in the Museo Archeologico, I'm probably butchering how to say the archaeology museum in Italian, is in Florence. And we went off to go see them. And we had like 1 hour to find them if they were on display. I thought they were on display because I had seen pictures other people had taken of them on display. But all of those pictures were sort of in a vertical display. And we went into the museum and we headed off towards the Egyptian, Etruscan and Egyptian side. And we went through every room, just boom, 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 boom. Don't stop and look at anything. Don't stop and look at anything. You have 1 hour. You can look at things on the way back out, and where were they? Absolutely in the absolute last room you could possibly get to in the museum.
Those are some big feet.
They're huge. Exactly. We walked in. I had only really ever seen photographs of them, right? And the photographs were like this big, and they were usually taken next to the child sock that is also in this museum. But of course, it's only one. So they take the picture of it and they put the picture of the pair, and they look kind of the same size in the photographs they're willing to print, right? I walked in, those things are laying flat, not up on the wall like I had seen them before, on kind of a slanted support. They were flat in this display case. I walked in, I could see them across the room, and I'm like, holy, those are huge. They're huge. I'm used to them being small little ones, because it's usually the children's socks. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's huge. And I'm like trying to figure out how I'm going to take a photograph that isn't going to be distorted. I don't have a ruler with me. I do have my ticket. I took a picture with my ticket, but the problem is anything on top of the case is 6 inches above the socks. And there's distortion between your camera, the object, and an object further away. So what I did was I had my mother, because I needed to be able to use both hands on the camera to hold it in this position. I had my mom stick her hand down at the side of the case at the same level that the socks are lying on. I'm like, I can always measure mom's hand later. So that helps give you a sense of just how big those socks are.
Somebody with some big feet.
Yeah, definitely some big feet. And they're beautiful. They're just in amazing condition, really nice detail. I mean, yes, they've got holes in them. So what? It's a pair, guys.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Next picture. I did take some really good close-ups of it too, by the way. So this is the child sock that is usually photographed with those two. Note size difference. Okay, that's my hand, but my hands are the same size as my mother's hand.
Wow.
Yeah. And here's another picture of that sock so that you can actually see it better. Next. And a really cute cap in the back. So random other interesting things I discovered in Italy. We're in San Gimignano, and we're in the church museum, and I walk in and I see these paintings of saints. Okay, well, one's of Jesus and another one's of some saint or another. And I walk in and I'm like, there's this really weird texture on them. If you look close, you'll notice there's this kind of odd stripy texture to them. Flip to the next picture. And if you look at them from the other way, you have Mary and some female saint. These are early 17th, possibly 16th, late 16th century lenticular paintings. They are painted on sequential sets of triangular surfaces. So if you look from 45 degrees from one side, you see one painting. If you look from the other side, you see a different painting. And if you look at them straight on, you get this really weird amalgam of the two.
What a trip.
it really fascinated me, especially considering the fact that they were dated so early into the early 17th century. And that caused a certain amount of exploration off into Renaissance understanding of optics and optical illusions that they did in the late 16th century and early 17th century. Because the last lenticular thing I knew of were the little tiny, 3D, the little tiny hologram things that I used to play, little plastic ones that I played with as a kid and got out of my Cracker Jack box. I did not expect to find those in 17th century Italy.
That's crazy.
Next. So of course, too much time in Italy and too much time I need feast gear, and I've been staring at beautiful plates in museums. My husband decided for my birthday one year he was going to take me to the, paint your own ceramics. And I was not prepared. So this is me doing a terrible rush job. We spent hours there with like the worst brushes in the world, desperately trying to go, I had not thought out what my pattern was going to be, but let me go dig through my phone and my photographs to try and figure something out that will work for the plate. So it's technically not finished. There's black outlining to be done on the device, but I thought it came out okay.
Very cool.
Next. So I've already told you a bit about the pinwheels. So related to pinwheels are also stiff flag fans, which are amazingly effective, by the way. The little folded ones, not so good, take way too much energy. A stiff flag fan like this, I had learned in Taiwan how little energy you have to move an awful lot of air. Very effective, useful things. And they show up in Ottoman Empire, and they show up in Italy and like France and a number of other places. This particular one was built for, there was an Ottoman reign in Atlantia, and they were desperately looking for Ottoman appropriate largesse. And I was like, wait a minute, I could make flag fans. They're kind of like flat pinwheels. I could do that. All I have to do is go find some cool Ottoman book and, shove spike in where the words were. Yeah. Next picture. So I made a few, kind of a lot, and they took them off to court. And so like everybody in court were dying in the heat in Penzig, and everybody in court's got their little flag fan. It was great. So you noticed how the books kept getting bigger and bigger and more, they get heavy. You want to cart all the books around, and then you've got to cart all of like, whatever this project is. And I have to have my food, and I need to have my table, and I need to have whatever. I can't carry all that. I couldn't carry it when I was healthy, and I spent most of my adult life in chronic pain. So by this point, I'm not particularly in chronic pain, but I'd rather not go back there that often. It still hits me occasionally. And I'd rather not spend too much time in it, and I can't carry all my stuff, and I can't depend on everybody else for all the stuff. So I'll have stuff for class, and I'll have stuff for the research, and I have stuff for what I want. Yeah, I usually have 3 or 4 different distinct sets of stuff, and I don't want to walk from my car to the event, drop it off, walk back out to my car to the event, drop it off. So one of the other things that I found particularly fascinating is fenced wheelbarrows, which, by the way, look an awful lot the same from the 12th century when they first show up in Europe all the way through the 16th century. And I have a friend of mine who owns a wood shop, works in a wood shop, and he's a wooden boat builder. Wow. And he keeps trying to get me to come out and do things in his shop. And so I was like, well, I like to make a wheelbarrow, but I don't quite know how. And he's like, okay. And so my other friend who actually owned the building that this particular wheelbarrow was built in the shop, where a couple of friends of mine shared materials, got to laugh because, he let 2 Laurels loose in his wood shop. And there's a certain amount of over engineering in the wheelbarrow, and yes, all of the glue is scraped off, including on the inside underside of the inner part. At one point I went, wait a minute, knock it off. No one else will see it. Leave it alone. You don't. You can put.
It's beautiful.
Put it down. So this is our prototype. I loved it. It was great. It's white oak, which should be heavy, but I could lift it in and out of the back of my pickup truck with no trouble. It really was very stable, solid. You'll note that there's a string hanging down there from the handles. So as I was using it, I realized that A, it was a little bit short, and B, we had built it to the basic instructions in a book where they had measured one and, built one out, and we kind of followed their instructions mostly, sort of. But we had entirely neglected to take an important dimension into account, which is how wide my hips are. So one would like to carry the wheelbarrow with one's arms just barely flexed, but mostly straight, excepting that doesn't work because now it's banging in my thighs. So it would go past my waist, but then I've got my arms up and my elbows out, and you can't bear a lot of weight that way because it's all muscle and no bone use. And I was getting tired doing that. And I started looking at the photographs again of the illuminations and paintings of fenced wheelbarrows. There are bucket wheelbarrows as well. There's two types of wheelbarrows. This is a fenced wheelbarrow meant for carrying large, odd loads, like, large bits of logs and bags of flour and gravel and whatever. And
things that won't fit in a bucket.
Things that won't fit in a bucket, but are also unlikely to fall off, which might mean that they're things that would fall off, but we've shoved them in a basket and tied them on it. But that also works. But what I noticed is that a significant number, not all, but a significant number of the illuminations of the fenced wheelbarrows had a carrying strap. The person wheeling the wheelbarrow had a carrying strap. So I went and I found myself a hemp belt that I then proceeded to transform into a carrying strap. And oh my God, it's amazing. You can like walk down the road and you can wave to your friends and you can actually drink liquids and still be pushing the wheelbarrow. Oh, and by the way, it actually makes it less heavy because now it's draped across your shoulders and it's not just in your arms. And so this was good and I loved it. The stick that's sticking up at the diagonal out of the bed of the wheelbarrow there is actually based on, because it isn't a reproduction, it's based on a 14th century runic perpetual calendar stick out of Sweden. Oh, cool. I got very fascinated for a long time with the runic calendar sticks as well. And they are post-Viking, pre-Reformation generally, although slightly into post-Reformation. Perpetual calendar sticks. They're pretty fascinating stuff. They involve, I learned all about the metonic cycle, which is how you tie the lunar cycle to the solar cycle. It runs every 19 years, but so you can get when the new moon is because you need it to calculate Easter. And the other row is like when the solar holidays are. And then there's a third row, which is the days of the week. And they did their days of the week, much like we did, which are the first 7 letters of the alphabet. And so you just need to know which year is Sunday this year, which letter is Sunday this year. And that's how it worked.
Wow.
Next. So I had decided that it was difficult for me to use the wheelbarrow because of my hips, but it turns out that Arab Boy is shaped in a manner that fits that wheelbarrow very, very well. And he really wanted the wheelbarrow. He's like, I want that wheelbarrow. I really want that wheelbarrow. And I'm like, well, I kind of need to make myself another one, but I'm not, I wasn't really inclined to be making wheelbarrows for people. I don't really want to make you a wheelbarrow, but I was thinking I needed to make one for another one for myself. So I might be willing to, sell this one. So, but you can see the basket that I've got in there, which I bought from IKEA and it fit perfectly. That was not what I bought the basket for, but it fit. So that's useful for when you have smaller things that, might tumble. So you put the basket. Next. So I traded off my wheelbarrow for glass blowing lessons for me and my friend Reynard, who helped me build the wheelbarrow.
Yes, please.
Yes. So here I am at Penzic in the high heat of Penzic, working with molten glass.
Wow. How cool.
And having a great time after I recovered from having burnt my fingers on the first day. Next.
Wow. Oh. Suddenly my fingers don't work.
Yeah, there it is. So these are my practice pieces. This is what I got to learn. I got to play with fishies to help work the tools. And then I blew a little glass toothpick holder with a molded bit on the front and a little tiny shot mug, because I haven't yet figured out how to get enough gather on the glass to blow anything that isn't just a little tiny bubble.
Wow, how fun.
Next. So this is the replacement wheelbarrow. It is wider, which does mean it's a little less wieldy, but it is wider and it is prettier with the swoopy arms, which also means that they aren't ankle biters. The problem with another problem with that first wheelbarrow is that it was so low, my husband wouldn't see it and he would trip over it. It would catch his ankles and he would trip. Next. So here I am talking, explaining the new wheelbarrow to people at Penzic versus the old wheelbarrow of Penzic at the ANS display. And of course, we're talking about miscellaneous socks. And so there's the pair again. And then there's a little tiny pair right there in the front that you'll get to hear about shortly later. Next. Most of my Penzics are usually spent enjoying my time, hopefully chatting with others while crafting under our new lean-to. Next. So a friend of mine was getting elevated to the Order of the Laurel, and she, her primary area of focus is Viking engineering, but she also is kind of known for hand sewing her own garb. Like, she doesn't own any garb that isn't hand sewn. And one of the traditions in Atlantia, it's not a requirement, but people like to do it, is that they like to give a laurel cloak at the elevation, which is why I have the fancy new laurel cloak, because I moved over here and everybody's like, where's your cloak? And I'm like, I don't have one. But anyway, they want, and so, but people were a bit worried about it. They're like, but everything she owns is hand sewn. And, we're like, well, what does she want? What's going to work for her? And she decided she wanted one of the Viking kaftan style coats, coat being much more comfortable than a cloak. And I said, okay, fine. I will draft that on you. She's like, I can't draft it on myself, she says. And I would like one for the ceremony, because she had a vigil and then sometime before Penzic she got, well, actually what she got was a writ. And then she was going to do the vigil at Penzic and then the elevation at Penzic, because she was also from the East and had moved around, and Penzic was the best place for like all her people. And she wanted to have a laurel coat, but she didn't know how to ask anybody to actually sew. I'm like, come here, let me fit you, because she's like, I can't fit this on my own body. I'm like, you come to my house, I will fit you. I fitted her. I put it on the body and I fitted the coat on her. I sent her away with, here's lining material. I need you to cut it out and do what embroidery you want to do on the thing. And then I need you to give it back to me in cut pieces. You must give it back to me in cut pieces. So I had the cut lining and the cut out coat at Penzic. Like, I got it like just as I was heading to Penzic. Her elevation is going to be on Wednesday of the second week. Guess what I did all Penzic? I hand sewed a fully lined floor length coat. And so I was working on it and working on it and working on it, and it was going okay, but I was like, it's a lot of work. It's a full size coat. We're like taking the silk and actually plying it and replying it so that I can actually have cords to sew down the edges of the openings and stuff, which involved That's the only cheating we did with electric materials, is because plying that stuff was taking me too long to do by hand. So at one point we had black silk strung out across the entire courtyard of our encampment, and the drill going bzzz. But I realized that it would be helpful if I had other people help me. And so every time when I was under my tent there, anytime anybody came to visit me, I'm like handing them off a piece, and I'm like, I need you to sew this part, right? And people were doing that, and it was fine, but it was only helping so much. And time is running out, and it comes her vigil, and I'm sitting there a couple of days beforehand going, her vigil's coming up. Hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. There will be people sitting around with nothing to do while they wait to go talk to her. I think I will be conscripting the peoples, I said. So I went to her vigil early so that I would be there very early. And as people came in, I'm like, would you like to help sew on her laurel coat? And they're like, a lot of them are like, oh my God, I couldn't do that. My stitches aren't pretty enough. I'm like, you don't understand. The coat is now at a stage where all the lining is sewn to the outer piece, because each piece was lined and then they were getting sewn together. But what I need is I've got like an inch worth of seam allowance here, and I need it whip stitched like every centimeter so that, the thing doesn't fray on her eventually. Can you stay within an inch and like not cross this line, and just like whip stitch something about a centimeter. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It really doesn't. No one will ever see these stitches. They're like, I can sew on a laurel cloak and no one will see any mistakes I make. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I can do that. I can do that if it doesn't have to be too pretty. I'm like, dudes, centimeter or smaller, somewhere in there, not too tiny. Don't waste your effort. So I have all 8 pieces of her coat farmed out here. It's black wool with a red lining. They are at least sewing with white linen, but it's black wool with a red lining, and they are entirely sewing by candlelight. And it made, there were people who were talking about that vigil for ages afterwards as like, this is their medieval moment. People were together and they were all working on a communal project and they were all sewing. I was sitting there going, this is great. I've handed out all 8 pieces. There's nothing for me to work on. Do you need more light? Can I get you some more thread? Here, have the wax.
That's awesome.
So next. So this photograph was taken at least a year and possibly 2 years prior to COVID. Just saying. I've been wearing face veils on occasion to events for significantly longer than some. And the main reason is that I have troubles breathing, particularly in the cold. And if I'm having, a reactive episode at the time, I need to keep warm, moist air on my face. So here we are. And next slide. So in 2016, people were trying to get me to start back in my research. I had to take some time off. I had some significant medical issues that cut down on my physical energy and my mental energy. And I mean, I wasn't even able to bend my fingers further than this. So like, energy to make things or research was not happening, but they kept bugging me. And by 2018, I was feeling better. I'd gotten better medical care. We'd figured out what the problem was. We were starting to solve it. And I was having people ask me from the SCA side about Egyptian null binding. And I was having people ask me from the academic side about Egyptian null binding. Because remember, back at that NESAT that I went to in Germany, they kept asking me, so what's your research topic? What are you going to be doing in 2011? Right. I'm like, well, I think I'm going to explore the Egyptian null binding next. Yeah, it only took 7 more years to get to it, but I did. But I was getting the same question from both of them. And while I had not been doing a lot of null binding research in a while, not focused analytical research, I had been doing the same thing I did in those first 2 years before I really started research at all, which is interesting tidbit of null binding crosses my field of view. And I snag it and I put it in the folder. And another one comes by and I put it in a folder, and another one comes by and I put it in a folder, and I do this for like forever. And eventually I feel well enough and people are asking me questions. I'm like, I know that the answer exists and I'm pretty sure I have it in that folder. The problem is I don't know what I have in that folder. I haven't analyzed it. I haven't sorted. I have no idea. I know I have lots of pictures of Egyptian socks, what I thought were lots of pictures of Egyptian socks at the time, by the way. That's entirely different than it's less than half of what I've got now. Like of just the number of socks, not the number of pictures. But I had what I thought was a significant collection because, of course, null binding is a relatively rare craft in comparison to the number of woven textile finds that you find throughout Europe. It's a narrow percentage. There's a whole bunch of weaving and a little tiny bit of null binding. So in circumstances where the preservation conditions are not good and you don't find a lot of woven materials, the likelihood of finding null binding, i.e. that tiny percentage, is drastically smaller. So what happens is I think we're doing really, really well if I find one null bound object per country per century. That's like great. I'm starting to be able to see a trend, right? Yeah, once every 100 years you see a thing, right? What trends is this going to tell you? Egypt was fascinating because it's one of very few places in the world, the other primary area being the Andes mountain region in South America, so primarily Peru, but also Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, that kind of region. Has the preservation conditions that you can end up with more than one object per country per century, like 5 or 10, or what I now know to be approximately 70. Yeah, but it's like there's like a lump, right? And so I was like, you're asking me questions that I know I would know the answer to if I knew what I had in the folder. So I sat down in July of 2018 and I just started taking all of the photographs that I had collected, photographs from books, photographs off the web, photographs from wherever I had managed to find a photograph of it, and put them together so that I could see how many views of any one particular object do I have. Can I see the left side, the right side, the top, the bottom, the back? Did anyone take pictures of the toes? Please, somebody take pictures of the toes. No, I mean like straight on take pictures of the toes. Like, how am I supposed to tell how this thing starts if you refuse to take pictures of the toes? And so I started putting it together, and 20 days later, I'm like, you must stop this. You have to pack for Penzik. And I had an 86-page document of mostly pictures of socks, primarily pictures of socks, with a little bit of data like where I found the picture, or at least where I could find the picture now. Because when you do that grab as things go past your field of view and you shove them in a folder, 15 years later, you don't know where you found that.
Yeah.
You just don't. So where can you find it now? TinEye, reverse image search, these things are your friends. And I would go through and find the thing, and I'm looking for it and finding the piece. I finally found some stuff, and so I have this thing and I start answering the questions. And my friend from academia is like, hey, there's this conference going on in Copenhagen in January. The call for papers is out. You should submit an abstract. And I'm like, an abstract on what? I don't have a thesis. I barely have the start of an incomplete data set. I don't have a question. I don't have an answer. I don't even know what the questions are yet because I don't know what data set I have to find out what questions I should be asking. He's like, yes, but you have a data set no one has. Write the abstract. Okay. So I did. That was great fun. So then I spent, because they were going to record that presentation and publish it online, each individual presenter had to obtain proper permissions from the copyright owner for any illustrations, any pictures that they used, which in the case of museum objects generally involves asking the permission of the museum. Just because I have a photograph out of a book means the person who published the book had the permission to publish it in the book, but it does not mean that I have permission to publish it online.
Right.
And so that involved an awful lot of searching because, of course, very few of these socks are actually aggregated in one institution. It's one sock here and one sock there and one sock over there. So now I have to go find out what are the rights of this sock and this object online. And some of them are very generous and they say, here's the picture and it's public domain, do with it as you will. Some of them are, you know, here's the picture, you can republish it online if you cite us properly, give a link to our site, and are not doing it for commercial reasons. Other ones are like, contact us and pay the money, you know, because publishing online is the same as publishing in the web. It usually has a different price structure and a different timing, but the concept of the copyright is similar. And so I had to reach out to all these institutions. Well, this got some very intriguing results because as you're searching for the institution to ask and you're reaching out to them to ask them about it, more and more finds keep falling in my lap. I keep finding more socks and more socks. And I didn't know you had socks. And oh my goodness, I asked if I could use that picture and you handed me 12 more beautiful ones. Megabytes are you trying to send me? Oh my goodness, they're gorgeous. You know, and all of that sort of thing. And so it just expanded and grew and expanded and grew. And I was desperately trying to put the photographs together and figure out what permissions I had, which ones I had, which ones I didn't have permission for yet to actually complete the presentation on time. But the presentation's in Copenhagen and it was being done in Copenhagen, which meant I had to get to Denmark from the US. Well, there aren't really any decent flights straight to Copenhagen from the US. Not that's like cheap enough I'm willing to pay for it. So what you do is you take the cheapest flight or reasonably cheap flight over to somewhere in Europe. And then once you're in Europe, then you get to Copenhagen. Much cheaper, much easier, and well, a heck of a lot more fun. So mom's like, well, where else are there null binding artifacts? And having recently done my 86-page doc, I had a better idea of where these socks were located. And I'm like, well, Mom, there seem to be a bunch of them around Manchester, England. And I've never been to Manchester. Mom's like, neither have I. Let's go. So the Whitworth had 5 null-bound objects, of which I'd only seen pictures of one. 4 of them had never had pictures taken that were published, so I hadn't seen them. The Manchester Museum itself had 1 baby sock, which I did have 1 or 2 pictures of, but not really great ones. And the Bolton is not that far away, and they have 2 fragments, which unfortunately were not on display, and I did not manage to get a chance to go see. But we tried. We're like, let's go see if we can find them. Lots of cool and interesting things. No sock fragments. And then the Ashmolean had 1 sock that had been on display. There's 1 really bad vacation photo that somebody took. It's out of focus, but it's like the only photograph of the sock that's available. And it clearly was on display at the time it was taken, but that was like 2010. And this is, 2019. And I don't know. So we get to the Ashmolean, blah, blah, blah. So one of the other places that there was a sock was the Leicester Museum. Well, the Newark Museum in Leicester. And we wandered around the museum and I'm like, I think the sock is on display because they had recently done a video tour of the museum. And I had thought I had seen it in the video tour, like just this little tiny dot on the wall, right? So I'm like trying to find this wall case where it is. And here I am, I have found the wall case and mom takes this picture of me taking a picture of the sock, which is the colored thing in the top right on the second shelf there. And you can just see in my camera, the sock. I have a lot of pictures of mom taking pictures of me taking pictures of things. And if you'll go to the next, oh, it's a cute little baby tunic right next to it. So, that's a child sock and it was a baby tunic. So this is the pair I had shown you had been up on the wheelbarrow before, right? So this is the little pair of socks I had made based on a photograph of the sock in the Newark Museum in Leicester. And I thought I had actually been making myself a pair. But if you look really closely, you will notice that those are both right socks.
Oh, whoops.
Now, the other thing to pay attention to these socks is look carefully at the color banding of the socks, because now I'm going to ask Asha to click to the next slide, please. So that's the real thing. So I didn't do too half bad. It's in a bit worse condition, but the one thing to note is you'll notice that right at the top side, at the top edge there, that's red, not purple. Next. So I take lots of pictures trying to get all of the angles that I can get. And I can't get the far side of this sock because it's in a wall cabinet, but I did get a decent shot of the toes. That was quite tricky past the other shelves and the other objects and a few like this, which is where I realized that it's green on the toes and it's green across the arch, but it's blue around the heel cup.
Oh yeah, wow.
Next. So here we are in the Ashmolean as I'm desperately trying to find out whether or not that sock is still on display. And the answer is no. So here I am trying to write to the conservators because I have now discovered that it's up in the conservatory laboratory, conservation laboratory. And I'm sending them an email. Here I am poking my finger, sending them an email going, is anybody going to read their email at 4 o'clock on the afternoon on a Friday? Maybe. Anybody there? It was 3 weeks later that I got the answer, but there we are. So one of the other really cool things is that Regina Giovanni, who has done some work studying the sock in the Manchester Museum, lives in Manchester. And so, hey, null binding person, I get to meet a null binding person. So here we are in the hotel and I'm showing off and actually a knitted swatch that a friend of mine, Candace, did based on the knitting instruction in Pfister and Bellinger's original article about the textiles from Dura Europus, which had a really weird sort of decrease in it. And so here I'm showing her that and then showing her, how you can tell the difference between null bound and crossed knitting. Next. So one of the other places that was on the list of places that had socks near Manchester was the Warrington Art Museum and Gallery. And it's one of those fascinating old, Victorian era naturalist collections type museums that I absolutely adore. They are jammed packed full of stuff with really crazy bad labels, tiny labels in handwriting, and we're like, I had written to the Warrington and I had asked them if I could see the sock, but I'd gotten no response. And so, well, we'll try it. It's not that far. It's just a quick train ride. Regina came with us. We went to the museum. We poked around. We looked in all the back corners of all of the cabinets trying to see if there was a sock. We couldn't find the sock. So we go see the docent, and we were like, is there a little blue child sock on display? Because I knew it was supposed to be blue, right? And they're like, oh, no, there's no sock on display. But if you fill out this form, the collections manager might be able to pull it from storage for you to come look at in the future. And I'm like, I am in Manchester for 2.5 days. I'm not going to be here very long, but I'll fill out the form because my friend Regina is in town. She lives in Manchester. It's not too far away from Warrington. She can come see it. Maybe she can send me a photo or two, right? So we fill out the form, and the docent is quite surprised as I pull up my little doc on my phone. I love smartphones, with the inventory number. I'm like, I want this sock. No. This sock, this one right here. So we go and explore the rest of the museum because, hey, we're here and it's a museum and it's cool and it's lots of fun. And we go looking for the sock. Halfway through the museum, we had not gotten halfway through the museum when the collections manager came and found us and says, I know exactly what sock that is. I know exactly what box it's in. It's in a box with a small collection of other Coptic textiles. I'm going to the warehouse storerooms tomorrow, but I can't make it back to the museum, but I can bring it in on Wednesday morning. Would that be okay? And I'm like, I have nothing planned on Wednesday, and I'm not flying out of Manchester until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll be here. So, it's pouring down rain. We get to the Warrington. We're running late because we missed the wrong, the good train, and we got the slightly slower train. And we get there, and clearly they haven't entirely planned for this because every one of the little conference rooms that they have in the museum was occupied by other people. So I ended up examining their little sock on one of the little dining room tables in the kind of cafeteria area that they have where they sell the postcards and the kids come through on the tours, including one set of kids that came through on the tour. But it was great fun, and I got to look at it, and it's beautiful. It's the most beautiful little blue sock, deep, gorgeous blue. And it's small. It's only about yay big. Lots of damage on the toes and the heel, but the important part is enough of the toe structure is there that I could tell them they had a left sock. And they're like, it's a left sock? I'm like, yes, it's a left sock. These socks have left socks and right socks, and this is clearly a left sock. See, this is how you tell this is a left sock. Like, wow, cool. So then we got on the plane and we flew to Basel. Next slide, please. Basel, land of basilisks. And next slide.
Wow.
So the Museum del Culturen has what they listed at the time as 26 Coptic era null-bound socks. Only a few of them have been published, and that was once and in the 1940s in an obscure German magazine. And one of those socks was part of why my friend in the SCA and my
Well, Sigrid, we've lost you. Can you hear me? I guess we'll wait for just a sec and see if she gets her internet back.
They are, and her stitch description was very, very strange. A very strange null binding structure. So most null binding is actually this kind of easy spiral of a structure, and which way it interlaces with stitches of itself, and the compound variants can vary. And of course you have simple variants, which are just like simple looping or loop and twist that don't interconnect with any other stitch in the same row. They just connect to the previous row. But in this case, it's one of the simplest versions that interconnect with a stitch of the previous row, but it has a very weird connection stitch the way she drew it. And well, if you turn that structure 180 degrees in the opposite direction, you end up with slip stitch crochet. So my friend Carrie Karp, who is applying his retirement from academia to a research project, because that's what you do when you're a retired academic. He is applying full academic rigor to the history of crochet. And here we are with a sock that potentially is listed as Coptic based on the art historical dating, because it was found with a bunch of other null-bound socks. And you know, someone else has analyzed the stitch and described it as null-bound. Now, mind you, she based that off of a 19th century hat that she found in Dokkum in Norway that couldn't be weaving and couldn't be knitting and couldn't be crochet, because modern crocheters do not tend to recognize slip stitch crochet as a stitch that is used to create a fabric. It's usually just a connector between other things. However, in the 19th century, it was the extremely popular way to crochet. So she thought it was null bound, and amazingly actually drew some beautiful diagrams on how to null bind that structure. Now, knitting and crochet are both loop-led looping structures. A loop comes through another loop, whether that's sequentially vertically or whether that's up and over and up and over and up and over, differentiates between the two of those. Null binding is also a looping technique, but it is end-led. So the entire end of the thread is drawn through each stitch. It can imitate or actually create the exact same structure as a looped technique, as the other loop techniques that are loop-led. Like, so null binding can imitate loop-led structures, but loop-led structures can't imitate null binding, because null binding can put a single thread through a closed loop. Knitting always has to have two threads through any particular loop, because you're pulling a loop with two legs. It's got to have two threads. Right. Null binding is only pulling one thread through. I can put two threads through if I want to, but I don't have to. She drew some beautiful diagrams for how you would null bind that structure, but they involved some really, really convoluted methods of increases, very convoluted methods of changing from front loop only slip stitch to back loop only slip stitch to closed loop versus open loop slip stitch. And well, if you were null binding that, you just wouldn't go there. I mean, you would have to know the structure you were trying to imitate in order to do that. And you would have to be doing it on purpose. Because otherwise you would null bind with increases and decreases that are more null binding like, and they don't go that way. There are easier ways to do that, much easier ways to do that. So we went to go, you know, he wanted to see the sock. He really wanted my opinion of the sock because he understands the crochet structure, but doesn't really understand the null binding structure. I understand null binding structures, although admittedly that particular null binding structure was one of those that kind of went in, that's in the weird department, and I'll figure that out later someday. Wasn't quite ready to try and figure out where that was. But he kept pushing and like, how can you tell it's null binding versus how do you tell it's crochet? And my friend from the SCA, Ibrahim, was also trying to figure that out and wanted to go look at it. And he was not able to go look at it. And Carrie wanted to go look at it, but he really wanted my opinion about it. And I'm like, I'm not going to be able to make an opinion about that without actually seeing it. There's too much strange going on. I need to see it. So you see it and I see it and we'll compare notes. Well, that's going to be tricky. That's hard. We might not take the right picture of the right thing. And then we're like, I'm going to Copenhagen. I have to go to Europe anyway. They have 25 other null-bound socks that we have like almost no data on. How about I just meet you in Switzerland? So we both end up in Switzerland and I get to meet my friend Carrie for the first time. So this is January of 2019. We've been talking since like July of 2018, like a lot. And it's like, oh, you have a face. So that's what you look like. And that's what you sound like. Because I know what you write like, but yeah. It's really interesting hearing that kind of sarcastic humor that you see in writing and then to hear it in the voice, it's very interesting to match up. But anyway, so we met and we examined this sock. And then I examined all of the other socks. So we got there at like 10:30 and they kicked us out at like 5, which sounds like a terribly long time, but calculate that out and divide it by 26.
Yeah.
It's not that long. That's a lot of socks to see in a very short time. But I am very grateful to the Museum de Couture for allowing us to do that. They were extremely helpful and letting us see the socks. And we also got to see a couple pieces of the blue and white Islamic knitted socks and a piece of tapestry and a really amazing knotted hat out of the Congo and just lots and just their warehouse is amazingly cool. And anybody who's interested in the blue and white Islamic socks really needs to talk to them because they have more than the few I saw. So I can't show you those photographs, but we did go to the museum afterwards and I found a piece of null binding on display. So this is a bilum, which is a traditional bag made out of from the country of Papua New Guinea. And in this case, it's really kind of interesting because it's intentionally made as a nationalistic bag because that's the flag of Papua New Guinea on it 4 times as well. Next slide. So string bag, bilum, Papua New Guinea, most typical everyday items. Next. While we were there in Basel, it was museum night. So I got to hear the horns, the Swiss horns. No, back up. You don't want to be on this one either. I'll start talking. Okay. That one, stop there. So I got to hear the Alpine horns in Switzerland. That was cool. And that's what that little clip was. So then we go and present the paper. And at like 1:30 at night, I managed to finish getting all the photographs and all of the citations and everything on the slides. But who might not have actually finished writing the words yet? So there was some dash. I was not the first presenter. There were several others ahead of me and a certain amount of jotting down notes and sorting things out. This is actually taken beforehand. I was displaying some of the objects and talking a little bit about it during one of the breaks. Next slide. My mother was kind enough to record as well, me presenting. Next slide, because you don't want to sit there. That's a half-hour conversation. I ran over, oops. But nobody complained because it was a really good presentation. It is recorded online in a much better version than that one and available. You can go to it via my blog. It's on my blog is nullbound.com, NALBOUND.com. And like the second entry on the blog is charting the null binding of the Nile, which has the link to the recording of that presentation. And I was honored to be able to, I managed to, in 3 months, get permissions for a significant portion of the photographs of socks out of Egypt. Not all of them, not all the permissions came in time. Not all of them gave them, although most of them did. And I got to include some photographs of socks that have not been published otherwise. So it's pretty cool. I also have some pictures of the Tarim hat in there as well, because I had to explain why calling the cross-knit looping that is the primary structure of 2/3 of the Egyptian corpus, the Tarim stitch, is a misnomer, because none of the Tarim hats are done in that stitch. It was a mistaken understanding interpretation of something in Elizabeth Whalen Barber's book. She acknowledged that she knew enough about null binding to recognize it was null bound, but not enough to be able to specify what stitch, and her little drawing caused people to presume that it was the cross-knit looping variant, and it's not, it's simple looping. But it means there's a lot of people out there who call it the Tarim stitch because it got misnamed. And there was a certain misunderstanding of the conventions of how to not name a null binding stitch as well. And the Tarim hat is not the oldest of that structure anyway. There's the fragments from Nahal Khamar caves in Israel, where there's both simple looping fragments and cross-knit looping fragments as well from that time frame. Anyway, digression. So we went to Yale to actually go see the Dura Europus fragment. And that, under my right hand there, is the remains of the sock that is the Dura Europus fragment. And on the screen, you can see that I've been pointing the endoscope at it, and it's under a certain amount of magnification. And I'm pointing out at that point one of the decreases that helps prove that this is a null bound sock and not a knit sock. Single strand through closed loop. Next. So work sent me to San Antonio. And while I was at San Antonio, Mom gave me a list of various and sundry fun things to do in San Antonio, one of which was go to the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. Now, I've been to a couple of Ripley's Believe It or Not museums in my lifetime over time, not for a long, long time, though. Like, Grandma used to take me when I was a kid, right? So I go and I'm enjoying the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum, and I'm wandering around, and all of a sudden it hits me. You have to remember that Mr. Ripley was one of the preeminent Victorian era collectors of stuff. Okay, he was a colonization, collector and potentially stealer of stuff. But nonetheless, he has a very large collection of stuff, and it shows in his museums. And so here you are just thinking that you're going around and having fun at some tourist trap. And all of a sudden there's a cassowary bird function and a sharpened lethal point. And it's a piece from New Guinea, from Papua New Guinea again, with null binding on the head of it. Next. Yeah, see? I still have to work on the structure, but why? Next. And then here we have another piece from New Guinea, which is a widow's finger chopper. I mean, it is Ripley's Believe It or Not. I mean, they are trying for the scary things sometimes too. But next picture. That's cross-knit looping, the same structure that's used in 2/3 of the Egyptian socks, but with spacing this time. And also the same structure that's used in a significant portion of some really amazingly beautiful Peruvian figural work. Next. From like the Paracas and Nazca period. So here, having come back from San Antonio, I wanted to go see the socks in the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum in Ontario, in Toronto, Ontario. They have 11 socks. So it's like the next largest collection of socks in one place. And I requested and was granted a 2-hour appointment to examine the socks, 11 of them, and you're not allowed to touch them. So we also went to the museum and found some more null binding around. So I can't show you those socks because there's an NDA involved, but this is on display in the museum. And so we don't have as much knowledge of African null binding as we should, because it does keep showing up in traditional usages. A lot of mid 20th century, some 19th century collected works keep showing up with null binding. So this is from Zambia. And if you'll flip to the next slide. So Congo and Zambia, they have these full masquerade costumes. Next slide.
Wow.
Some of them are in cross-knit looping. This particular one is in simple looping. Next slide. And I found a water jar with the bag to carry it from Venezuela. Next slide. Pretty bag. This is in loop and twist to make the bag. Regina will be interested because it reminds her of the decorations on some of the Roman jars that look like they might be this structure. Next. And then back to more Bilum from Papua New Guinea. Next slide. So here's one, very decorative one. Next slide. Oh, that's okay. All right. You're good. It's fine. There was another one. Oh, right. Okay. Close up of the structure. So you'll notice that this particular structure is not the usual spiral that we're accustomed to seeing in Egyptian and European style intra-connected null binding. That structure is also seen around the world as well. But one of the other styles is this hourglass shape. So you'll see hourglass or figure 8 shape. So these are doubly intra-connected looping. So they, instead of just connecting once, they connect twice, back and forth, and it makes this hourglass structure. A lot of people will confuse it with sprang because they won't recognize the connection stitches between the rows as connections, and it gives that tendency towards this sort of S and Z shape wave to it. So it can look a lot like sprang. So you want to pay attention to see and find those connection rows so you can see that these are horizontal.
Yeah, I would have taken a glance at it and said sprang, and it's not. When you look closer, it's totally not. Wow.
Next. Just the description and information on them. So you know where in Papua New Guinea. So while in Toronto, I also went up to the Bata Shoe Museum, where they have a 13th century sock from the ancient Pueblo cultures in Arizona. There are several of these socks, a whole bunch of them still in Arizona. Mesa Verde, etc. The cliff dwellers had these socks, and they tend to be made out of cotton or some vegetative bast fiber. And sometimes they have rabbit fur that they will incorporate in the plies to make sort of a chenille. Very fascinating stuff. Next. Simple looping, by the way. Next slide. And then here is another pair of traditional Iranian give. So shoes from Iran in null binding, little tiny rows. Next row, next slide. From there, we went down to Ann Arbor to the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology because they have a collection of finds from Karanis, and that incorporates many null-bound fragments, one of which is partially recognizable as a sock and tends to be their most demonstrated, famous object, but of the null-bound objects. But some other very interesting bits. We were in the City Museum across the street, kind of biding our time until my appointment. And we found another one of these masks So sometimes they're masks, sometimes they're hats, sometimes they're full body suits out of Central Africa. Next. So one of the other parts, I like toys. I really like toys. I like to play with toys. And I had actually made a reconstruction of this particular little Byzantine horse, Roman era, Byzantine era horse. And so I was so excited to be able to see it on display and get this shot because it told me how they made the axles on the wheels. A piece of data that you don't get when you're looking at it from the side.
Yeah. Wow.
Next slide. See, here's a few of mine. And that one in the bottom right should look relatively familiar, although you aren't used to seeing it from that angle. You just saw it from, the tail end. But that's kind of what it looks like. Next slide. I really like to play with toys. So I was doing a medieval toys competition. And while I was waiting for all of the entries to come in and the miscellaneous judging to happen, I was occupying the children by having them take willow fronds and find the nearest puddle to soak them in so that I could build things. One of which was this little pull sled that I saw in an illumination. And this is me wandering around the site going, it works, it works, it works. So here's a good shot, a better shot of those pinwheels I keep referring to, the windmills. They come in 4 blades or 2 blades. And one 12th night in Atlantia, we had palio races. So you had to bring your horse to the races. So everybody brought their hobby horses. I had to bring a full pedigree for mine because I was pretty sure that everybody would look askance at my very sleek racing horse, because I, of course, used the sleekest of racing horses possible, i.e. a stick. No embellishment except for like a bridle. So here we are. Now we've gone back to Copenhagen. So this is August and I'm in Copenhagen again, the same year. And the reason for this is after the conference in Copenhagen in January, one of the things you do when you go to conferences is that they tend to have excursions. And in this case, they had an excursion to the National Museum of Copenhagen, where a curator was taking us around and giving us a little tour of their Egyptian collection in the museum on display, right? So we got to see the ancient Egyptian section and the Coptic section. And they said to us there, one of the ladies asked, are there any other Coptic textiles? Sorry. It's okay. Are there any other Coptic textiles there? And I had said, she said, yes, actually, we have a whole box of them that we haven't really looked at. We don't know what's in there. It's been here for we don't know how long. And I raised my hand and everybody laughs because, of course, the question I ask is, there wouldn't happen to be a sock in there, would there? Having just spent a half hour presenting the day before talking about how I do expect that there are more socks out there that we don't know of. So that previous picture was me eating cotton candy that evening with my mother. I finally got to take her to Tivoli in Copenhagen when it was open. She'd been trying to go for longer than I'd been alive since she'd gotten out of college. And so we finally got to go. So in the National Museum of Copenhagen, they also have the fragments from the Mammon graves, including the Mammon pennants with the 15 rows of metallic wrapped silk null binding down the center of them. Next slide. And I was granted the opportunity to examine them. Next slide. So here you can see I've got the endoscope again. And if you look on the computer screen there, you can see the close-up and you can see the thin metal foils as they are wrapped around the silk. That is the material that those are made out of. So primarily silver wrapped with sections of gold wrapped. Most of the silver wrapped has corroded away, so it's just the silk core. but the gold doesn't corrode that way. So it's still there.
Wow.
And that's 15 rows under my fingers. So they also have a collection of 17th century knitting and null binding upstairs. They asked me, do you want to go see it quick before we close? Yes, sure. Next slide. So null bound mitten from mid 1650-ish, mid 1600s thereabout. I love this one because if you look at the wrist, you can still see the jog of the spiral work. They didn't try to smooth that down or make it pretty. Next slide. And I took some close-ups of some of the knitting because I have friends who are interested in knitting details. Next slide. No one ever remembers to take pictures of the thumb tips and the tops of things. And these are important, very important for construction details and like determining technique, etc., and so forth. Next slide. So always take pictures of the tops and the edges. Next slide. And of course, we had to go visit the Little Mermaid. Next slide. So we left Copenhagen and we went to Nantes, France. And we discovered that in Nantes, France, it's the castles of the Dukes of Burgundy. I clearly had not been doing my research on, like, say, local geography. Next slide. I really hadn't been doing my research on local geography. We got a map there to try and figure out how to get to the museum, and there was this elephant on the map.
Wow.
I didn't realize that L'Île de Machine has their factory in Nantes, France, and they build these 3-story high automatons. It moves, it will spray water at you. It's great fun. Next slide.
Amazing.
And we ended that particular trip with a trip out to Mont Saint-Michel because we weren't sure we'd ever be on that side of France again. And it's a hill, and Mom made me climb all those steps. So having seen all of these null-bound socks, I started working on my reconstruction of what the Dur Europus fragment would have looked like when it was a sock, because it's really hard to see that flat fragment as a sock and how it works. So here I am trying to null bind the sock and working away. And Lily's like, okay, fine, you can null bind as long as I can have half this hand. Next slide. Not always do you get the starts right. I ended up with 6 different toes before I finally got the set I was going to use. These came in handy later. I ended up giving them away as souvenirs. So in October, I went to present at the Textiles from the Nile Valley Study Groups Conference, a paper on fringed and patterned null-bound socks. And on the way there, a friend of mine in Merdier's was getting elevated to Laurel for null binding. And her friends thought it would be really, really cool if I could show up. So as we went on the way to Europe, we took a side detour to Tennessee. And here I am looking at 19th century crocheted gloves. So, and here we are as we're letting her know, oh, but wait, by the way, don't get too shocked, but you're going to be a Laurel tonight. And hi. And I got to speak at her presentation at her elevation, which got delayed and delayed and delayed. And you know, when the sun goes down in the mountains of Tennessee in October, I was not prepared. I was a bloomin' ice cube. I literally had difficulty speaking. I was so cold. Next slide. So the sock continues to grow. Next slide.
Wow.
It looks ever so much better on a foot. But anytime that you have a decorative back, that decorative, we have socks with that kind of candelabra front. And then, you know, there's certain ratios for how big the heel should be versus how many stitches go around it, et cetera, and so forth. So you can see one pomegranate there. The fragment has 2. So I've got a whole nother layer of that to go. As we went to, in October, we went to the V&A. I got to look at their socks, except for the red ones, which were on display. Next slide. So here I am taking photographs of them. Next slide. Wow. These are the very famous red socks in the V&A. They were not where I was expecting them, where I had seen them the last time. And yes, always take photographs of the toes, please. There's so much detail you can see that way. I also got to see the socks and a couple of other objects, some Peruvian bits and some Omani sand socks in the British Museum as well. Next slide. And we took a brief run during our mandatory lunch break to the Petrie Museum to go see the pair that they had on display. Next slide. Always take pictures of the toes. Next slide. And the other side you don't usually get to see. Next slide. And then having left there, we were heading to our next location, which we were going to go to Oxford. And so I had to stop by and say hi to my friend Paddington. He had moved. He was not in the same place. So to get to the Pitt Rivers Museum, the instructions are to go into the Natural Museum in Oxford, and to go past the dinosaurs. Next slide. Turn left at Darwin. Next slide. And take the door to the right.
Wow.
Next slide. So the Pitt Rivers is another one of those Victorian era collectors' collections. It was donated to the University Town Museum. I'm not quite sure, remembering the details at this hour, as long as under the proviso that it be maintained in the manner that it was collected. So this collection is not displayed by time frame or location. It's displayed by type of object. So pots from around the world are all in one case. Writing implements from around the world are all in one case, to give you an idea of the variety that can be found throughout the world. It's a very interesting method, and they still use it for teaching purposes today. Next slide.
Wow.
They also have lots and lots of drawers, and they tell you to bring a flashlight, or they'll give you one, and you're allowed to open all the drawers. And so here is a net from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt in Loop and Twist. Next slide. And a dilly bag from Australia in Simple Looping. Next slide. And next slide. Some Nazca style Peruvian birdies. Now, this picture makes them look very big, but realize that those are less than 2 inches high. Next slide. And just amazing rings of those things. So we went to the Ashmolean as well. And to get to our appointment, we had to go through the fresco. It was cool.
Wow.
Next slide. I was like, I didn't even realize there was a door there when we walked in, and the sock continues to grow. Next slide. So while I was prepping the trip, and we were almost finalized, one of the ladies I had met in January at the original presentation told me that there were 4 socks in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. And I went, and one of them was going to be on display in an exhibition she was curating, and she wanted to know some info. And I'm like, I didn't even know these existed. So we made a detour to Amsterdam to go look at some socks. Next. And so remember I told you about that slip stitch crochet structure that could be null bound, but probably shouldn't, because that's an 80-hour hat. And if it was slip stitch crochet, I'd have been done in like 4. Next slide. Look, the Soxy's done. Next slide.
Wow.
So that's what the back looks like. The tree of life goes up the back of the heel. Next slide. And the fringe came out so fluffy. We don't have any evidence that the Dura Europus fragment had fringe. However, all other decorative socks with really decorative heel cups do. So I put one on there because I needed to test it anyway. Here I am preparing to present the fringed and patterned presentation. Next slide. And the exhibition after that conference was we went to Brussels to the, I can't pronounce it, the Royal Art Museum, it's a fancy name, to see their baby sock, which was on display. No, I was not able to examine it. That has been siliconed into that display cabinet until the exhibition's over. There's a little sock on the floor, by the way. There it is. Now you can see the sock instead of the really cute kid's tunic. As I'm trying to get all angles. Next slide. Then I took a detour to Leiden because the Knitting History Forum was having their conference there the week after. I wasn't able to stay that long, but they also had put up some null binding in their socks exhibition. And they had a pair of Omani sand socks. Now in the Pitt River, I had examined a whole bunch of Omani sand socks that were collected in the 1980s. And so here was another opportunity to examine a pair of null bound socks from Oman. The interesting part here is that is not the Omani stitch. The row heights look fairly high, but what they are is not row heights. Those are 2 rows. So it's 2 rows of white. One passes it and then comes back around. And then it's 2 rows of black. It's not one large row. Next slide. This is their exhibition of the sock that was found in the shipwreck in Texel with the whole gown and everything. And then they went through the whole scientific bit of trying to actually get the knitting and figure out how long it took and all of that. So this is the whole display. It was very fascinating. Wow. Next slide. So a week after I got home, I ended up in, there was a conference by the Textile Museum in Georgetown, in DC, in collaboration with Dunbarton Oaks and on Coptic textiles. So I had to go. It's only like 2 hours away. If I'm willing to go to Europe, I should be willing to drive to DC. It's only,
it's such a great museum.
Oh, it is. And they were just reopening it. Yeah, well, they've been reopened in Georgetown for a while, but I hadn't managed to go since they'd been over in the Embassy District. But they also had just opened up the Colson Center, Textile Center, like brand new. Like this was the preview. It wasn't even open yet, but like 2 days earlier, the furniture got in there and they got the stuff. So we got the early preview. And so that's another one of those cross knit looping figural works from like Nazca or Paracas, Peru, probably Nazca. Next. And a friend of mine is getting elevated. And so I wanted to show off the decorative hooks and eyes. And see, I still play in the SCA. Next slide. This last year has been a lot of home. So here I am, null binding away with a different cat. Next slide. I've been gardening a bit. One of my purple carrots. Next slide. I've been mapping null-bound finds by time frame and location. The purple ones with the M's are actually the museums in which the objects are located versus the other symbols indicate find locations.
Very cool.
X's indicate something that was thought to be null binding, but has since been discovered to not be. And the cups are textile impressions in clay. Next slide. And I've been working little test projects to determine various methods of heel flapped connections and edging and construction. Next slide. And I started working on a fun pair for me. We've been having null binding get-togethers twice every weekend, once on Saturday nights at 8 o'clock and once on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern time, my time. And I needed a project to work on. So I decided I was going to test out this new yarn, and it was fun. And then I got more new yarn, which is the red yarn. So I ended up making a pair of red socks. Next slide. In between the pair of multicolored socks. So these are done in the style of the V&A socks. Gauge is not quite right. It's a little heavy, but concept is there. Next slide. But because I did that pair in between doing the first one and the second one, I got the gauge wrong on the second one and missed a couple of increases. So I had to cut 3 inches off. Next slide. They're done. Woo-hoo. And well, I've had to deal with a lot of this. That would be Phoebe stealing my project. Next. So I've also been doing some work with tips and tricks a little bit. So this is, the red line is just using to help you see the point from center to where the connection is and then straight out from there. Because if my thumb loop is naturally leaning to the left and I'm trying to make this circle flat, I need an increase there. If my thumb loop is straight up and down pointing towards the center, I don't need an increase. And if my thumb loop is leaning to the right, I have too many. We're going to have some waves. Next slide. And I've been spending a certain amount of time discussing the structure of null binding and the various classifications. So the letters on the needle are how Hansen's classification is read. It's read from the technical front of the fabric, which means that if your thumb is in there, that's the part your thumb's touching. So Hansen's feels like it is worked from like opposite the way that you actually work it, because when you're working it, you're looking at the technical back instead of the technical front, if you're thumb tensioning, which you might not be. But this is how you read it. So it goes under the needle, then over, and then it goes back out. So it came into the previous stitches and then it goes back out, which is what the slash means, go back the other way, under and then over both the thumb circle and your following thread, your thumb loop and your following thread. Now, if you're reading that from the side that you're working it, you need to read not where the you need to not read the needle, you need to read the threads. So the thread is going under the needle, the thread is going over the needle, vice versa. Next slide.
That notation has always totally confused me.
Well, mostly because it's backwards from what people are thinking of.
Yeah.
Here's a slightly more compound variant. You've got under, over, over, under, over, over, which is the base stitch of Maman or Corgan or Moosin, because they vary by connection stitch. And if that's on my thumb, it feels like I'm going under 2, over 2, and then under the cross.
Right.
So, you know, what I have to look at from that point of view is what is the threads doing, not what is my needle doing. My needle is going under, but the threads are going over.
Right.
See, that's how you read it from the back. Read the threads, not the needle. Next slide. So the connections are all worked from the technical front. Oh, back one. The connections are all worked from the technical front, but the rest of it tends to be worked from the technical back. So, you know, that's part of what gets you confused. This is F1 heading towards F2. There's one loop on the needle and I got one new one and I'm about to take one old one. So that's going to be an F2 connection. Next slide. See, this is what happens when you get lost and you need to turn the fingers all the way up and look at the pad side of your thumb. Now, can you see how the under, over, over, under, under, over works? You're looking at the thread now, not the needle, because we're looking at the technical back. Next slide. And you can use it for figural work. Modernly, you can null bind anything you would like to do. I got told it was my my sister-in-law's birthday, the first Thanksgiving I went to meet the family, and no one had told me that a birthday was happening. So an angel appeared. And then this I did during COVID times. I decided I wanted a pumpkin. So here is my one of my newest projects, a pumpkin. And my truly newest project which is a braided edge null bound hat from yarn I picked up when I was in Iceland. I wanted it to match the lava cliffs and the moss on the lava cliffs. And Lily is very kindly
Modeling.
it for me. And that's the end of the photographs.
Okay, I'm gonna stop share. Wow, thank you so much.
Sorry.
It's okay. We're at about 3 hours and 20 minutes. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to cover tonight?
There's an amazing world out there, a huge world of all kinds of fascinating material culture. Go find what interests you.
Absolutely.
Go find it, go pursue it, go ask other people questions about it, work out how its structure works, work out what tools were used to make it. Those could be more interesting than the object itself sometimes. Just, there's a world full of fascinating stuff.
Don't be afraid to
and
explore.
yes, sometimes you have to deal with people laughing at you because, okay, so what did you go do on your vacation? I'm like, well, I went to Europe. Oh, that's really cool. What did you see in Europe? I spent all my time in the back rooms of museums looking at dirty old socks.
It's so cool.
It is so cool. It's so cool. I love doing it. My mom loves coming with me. I'm going to be absolutely devastated when mom is no longer able to travel because she makes the best research assistant ever.
Oh.
She's an engineer. She takes notes in handwriting you can read decades later.
Wow, that's fantastic. What are your next steps as we come out of COVID? What are your plans?
Well, step one is to hopefully recover some motivation. My motivation tanked. I feel fine. I've been extremely fortunate. We moved my parents out here like 4 years ago. Well, 4 years before COVID hit. So I could have been in a situation where my parents are 3,000 miles across the country in one of the hot spots of the world.
Yeah.
And instead, I've got them home with me on 3 acres where for some reason or another, even though I live in the middle of nowhere, I can still get Instacart. And I've got mom and dad and my 6 kitties all here. And by the way, Lily will never let me go back to work again. She has ideas about my even being allowed to leave the house. And gardening is the same as if I went to work. I have left the house without permission. She has firm.
She's not happy with that.
Oh no, she thinks the pandemic is the best thing in the world.
Our pets all think the same thing. Our kids, not so much. They're not so happy.
No, I can see where children would decide that they'd had enough of you, but my pets have decided that this is marvelous. And amusingly enough, it's the ones in my family who we thought were the most introverted and would be most happy as hermits who are the ones who are most agitating for like human contact outside of the home. I don't get it. The social ones are like, dude, it's great. I'm home. I'm good. And I've been able to rest and I've been able to heal, physically, but just I haven't been able to focus. And it's been a problem. I haven't been able to get a lot of my research done that I should have had done by now. I needed to stay home in 2020 because I did so much traveling in 2019. My budget needed me to stay home, and I need time to analyze the tons of photographs of the objects that I took, to find out what I can find out. I've been home all year. Have I been able to do that? No. I haven't been able to focus on it. I unfortunately missed a conference proceedings deadline. I do have my next new thing is I'm presenting at an ESAT conference. Oh my goodness. So I'll be presenting at the next ESAT conference. It's going to be on, if it might be in person in Oulu, Finland, but there will be an online component for those of us who are highly unlikely to be able to travel to northern Finland by August.
Yeah.
So I will probably be presenting from here. But I'm presenting on but it looks like how to tell the difference between the loop techniques when you have structural when you have structural confusion because both techniques can make the same structure. What secondary construction techniques can you look at to help you differentiate which technique was used to make this particular instance of that structure? And also common surface texture confusions, because a lot of times people who are uneducated in the details of the various textile techniques can get very confused by other structures. They look similar on the surface, even if the inside structure isn't the same. So there are some null binding structures that look an awful lot like crochet that aren't the slip stitch structure. There are null binding structures that look a lot like sprang. We saw that in the Belums already.
Right.
You know, how do you notice and how do you tell the difference for that? There are null bound structures that look a lot like tutu twill. Some of the Russian variants go over two, under two, over two, under two, and you turn that at a 45-degree angle because it's a scrap that's cut. Looks a lot like a woven twill, you know, tutu twill fabric, until you realize that there's parts where it doesn't go straight through, it does this.
It's such an amazing journey that you've been on, starting to do null binding in the SCA and then becoming a world expert. It's just what a great trip you've been on.
It's been a lot of fun. You know, there are choices that I made in my life that have made this an opportunity and a possibility, one of which is the fact that I have always loved to travel. I have always taken the opportunity to travel. All of my savings have been saving up for the next trip, you know, pretty much. And I was doing that even before I was looking at null binding. It's like, I want to go see the world. It's a fascinating place. Yeah. And so this is just fit right in that. And it's let me, you know, mom's like, ooh, where's the next null binding piece that we can go look at? Where are the ones in Spain? She keeps asking me.
She sounds like a great enabler. It's so fantastic. Well, we are at 3.5 hours.
Yes.
And it's time to shut it down. I think that we could probably go for 3 more. You're an incredible source of knowledge, and I appreciate your time so very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and for having me and letting me babble on about my miscellaneous adventures, because they're fun. I like talking.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. For those of you watching, thank you for sticking with us. This was amazing. And our normal Wednesday Sisters interview is switched to Thursday to accommodate our guest schedule. And we will have Duke Steercar on Thursday night. So we're really looking forward to that. And thank you, and we'll see you then. And Sigrid, thank you again so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.